Chapter 70. Help me kill two lackeys. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Han Shuo appeared directly within the secluded tomb, located in the mountains behind the academy through use of the transportation matrix, in the blind spot that he had dug. He put away the 6 magic sticks and removed the stone slab that blocked the entrance of the tomb before walking out of the tomb. The sky was only just brightening hazily, and Han Shuo didn't walk towards the academy. Rather, he took his bearings and circled the area, walking directly to the northern street according to the directions indicated on Fabian's card. The northern part of the city of Asen contained many tall, ornate buildings. Many of the empire's nobles and aristocrats lived here. The city's defense guard was also found in the highest numbers here, and there were many armored guards, wielding various weapons, patrolling early in the morning. Han Shuo cleaned up his clothes and wiped off the dust he had just acquired, walking towards the northern street, according to Fabian's instructions. Afterwards, Han Shuo stopped in front of a house after a while. There were no guards at the door and it didn't seem as conspicuous as the ones around it. Han Shuo walked up to the front door, gathered his concentration, and looked around him, finally knocking when he concluded that no one was paying attention to him. Last time in the Buzzed Merchant Guild, Phoebe had killed the assassins from Shadow Ghost and shifted the blame onto him. When Grover left the chamber, his expression was apparent that he was harboring resentment in his heart. According to Phoebe's explanation, whether it was Shadow Ghost or Grover, both had associates who could kill her at any time. Therefore, Han Shuo had to be extremely careful when returning to the Empire this time. He was deathly afraid of attracting Shadow Ghost or Grover's attention. After a while, a butler with warm features opened the door and gazed at Han Shuo, bowing with a smile. "Good morning, sir. Whom are you looking for?" "My name is Brian, and I'm here to discuss some matters of business with Fabian." Han Shuo also responded politely. "Mr. Brian. I've heard Fabian speak of you. Please follow me." The butler immediately turned his body sideways upon hearing Han Shuo's name and invited him in. When Han Shuo had walked in, the butler stuck out his head, carefully observed for a while in front of the door, and finally closing the door tightly afterwards. He was quite cautious and prudent as he led Han Shuo inside. The buildings inside were still quite ordinary. It all seemed rather dull when compared to the luxury of the Buzzed Merchant Guild. The surface area of the buildings were far less expansive and spacious than those of the Buzzed Merchant Guild. The butler led Han Shuo into the main lobby after walking for only a minute. An ordinary-looking maid served tea and snacks, after which she said, "Please wait a moment, Mr. Brian, I'll go get Fabian for you." When the butler left, the maid also left the lobby after pouring a full cup of tea for Han Shuo. After a while, the chubby Fabian walked in from outside the lobby, laughing heartily. Bright and clear laughter rang from his mouth, but his face looked a bit wan and his spirits didn't seem too good. He seemed to have been going through a difficult time lately. "It's Brian. It's so good to see that you're safe and sound." Fabian pulled out a stool for himself after entering and laughed loudly. "I too am very glad to see you unharmed. I hid after leaving the Buzzed Merchant Guild last time, so whether it's Shadow Ghost or Grover's men, they'll all be unable to find me. Therefore, you don't need to worry about me at all, but you on the other hand, you don't seem to have been living that well." Han Shuo sized up Fabian as he spoke slowly. "Don't mention it, Grover is becoming more and more domineering lately. Our lives have become a bit difficult." "Right. What business would you like to discuss this time?" Fabian sighed and said with some resignation. Han Shuo didn't want to pay attention to the old scores between Grover and them, and Fabian wasn't willing to truly discuss his feelings in detail. He thought for a bit and said, "I've come to find you this time not to sell any resources, but to purchase a few rare materials from you." "Oh, what rare materials?" "Take a look at this list. I need all the materials on it." "How many gold coins would this cost?" Han Shuo handed over the list that Chief Calvin of the dwarf village had written out to Fabian and asked. Fabian took the list from Han Shuo's hands and looked carefully at it, thinking for a bit before saying to Han Shuo. Brian, even I don't know some of the materials on this list. I'm afraid I can't make the decision. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask our Miss Phoebe to discuss with you. Han Shuo was startled, thinking did Calvin ask for some very precious items. He mused for a bit and nodded, all right, it's the same if I talk to Miss Phoebe. I have urgent need of these items, when can I see her? Our miss is right here. I'll go request her instructions, please wait a moment. Fabian rose and left Han Shuo with these words before leaving the lobby. Phoebe swept a nonchalant gaze over Han Shuo after she entered, making him feel a bit befuddled. She found a seat and thoroughly perused the list that Han Shuo had brought. She furrowed her brows slightly as she lifted her head to look at Han Shuo. These materials should be for the use of forging weapons. Some of the items within are very rare indeed. You've come to the right person to purchase them. Joy flooding his heart, Han Shuo kept a calm expression on his face and randomly tapped his right finger on the table. He said lightly, "What's your price?" Nodding, Phoebe's wise eyes sparkled cunningly as a slight trace of a beautiful curve marked her slightly tightened lips. She said, "With the exception of the black gold ore, we can sell all the other ingredients to you. Particularly because you helped us last time, I'll even give you a discount. It will only cost you 3,500 gold. This price is absolutely fair. 3,500 gold. Han Shuo's heart leapt in shock. He hadn't thought that the 10 or so missing ingredients that Calvin had listed would be so pricey. And judging from the connotations from Phoebe's words, this price was already quite low, and that the black gold ore seemed to be of some difficulty. His brow furrowing slightly, Han Shuo thought deeply and said, 3,500 gold is no problem, but is your guild unable to obtain black gold ore? Black gold ore is the same as black iron ore, they're materials of the utmost quality used for forging weapons. The price of these kinds of ore is beyond your imagination. A piece of black gold ore the size of a fingernail can fetch the price of 5,000 gold on the marketplace. Under normal circumstances, there is no supply for both black gold and black iron ore, at any price. I have a piece of black gold ore the size of my thumb in my possession, but I only gained this piece of black gold ore at extreme effort. I was planning on forging the best sword for my respected teacher when I collected enough material, that's why I've kept it all this time. Therefore, even though this piece of black gold ore can satisfy your needs, I will not sell it to you no matter how high a price you offer. Phoebe's face was solemnly grave as she said resolutely to Han Shuo. Phoebe was a swordswoman, and Han Shuo could figure out with even his toes what kind of level of character her teacher would be. The kinds of swords used by such a character would naturally be uncommonly sharp. As Phoebe had reached the level of swordmaster at such a tender age, she must not have been taught at an ordinary academy of magic and force. Phoebe was a mysterious character indeed. However, Han Shuo truly needed the black gold ore. He wanted to create the best possible Demon's Lair edge in one go, and naturally needed the exact amount of the rarest materials. If he was short on the valuable black gold ore, then the quality of the Demon's Lair edge would decrease greatly. This was what Han Shuo didn't wish to see the most. His brows locked tightly, Han Shuo pondered hard and finally asked Phoebe, apart from you, who else would have black gold ore in their possession? Don't wish for the stars. I think even if someone had some, they would cherish it like treasure and wouldn't sell it to you. Phoebe looked at Han Shuo's anxious expression with interest, a hint of a faint smile curving at her lips as she said with some pride. Han Shuo felt an involuntary wave of depression when he heard these words, but suddenly detected Phoebe's unintentional hint of a smile at her lips when he was shaking his head and sighing. His thoughts spun furiously as Han Shuo thought silently. He finally stared straight at Phoebe and asked lowly, Miss Phoebe, if you're willing to give the black gold ore in your possession to me, you can name whatever condition you wish. Phoebe started and looked at Han Shuo in some surprise. She then frowned and pretended to turn the matter over in her mind. She finally said with some reluctance, "I can bear the pain of giving up something I value very much because you helped us last time, but you must help me with another task." Help in doing what? Han Shuo privately thought that Phoebe had indeed been scheming early on. Although he felt angry, he didn't let it show on his face and responded with a grave face. "Fight by my side and assist me in killing the 2 lackeys most loyal to Grover, Darnell and Yuna, those 2 be asterisk cheese that should be hacked to death by 1,000 cuts." Frost grew on Phoebe's charming face as she spoke through gritted teeth. "What are their strength, respectively?" Han Shuo's face was calm as he asked. "Darnell is a senior swordsman and his strength is almost at the level of breaking through to swordmaster, while Yuna is a fire adept mage and her strength is extremely frightening. The 2 are a couple who are beyond depraved and exceedingly shameless. They basically do not spend long amounts of time apart from each other. They currently both live within the Buzzed Merchant Guild. If you're willing to aid me, I have a 60% chance of assassinating them without a sound." Phoebe's body abruptly straightened, highlighting the soaring twin peaks in front of her chest as she spoke excitedly. "I promise to help you." Han Shuo didn't hesitate as he spoke in a low voice. Chapter 71. A moment of grace before the prelude of assassination. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. After spending an entire day preparing, Han Shuo and Phoebe took a carriage at dusk to the Buzzed Merchant Guild in the southern part of the city. Han Shuo and Phoebe sat shoulder to shoulder within the carriage. 2 primitively simplistic crossbows, decorated with intricate carvings, were placed in front of the 2. In addition to this, there was a dagger that sparkled with cold light. This crossbow and dagger will be of much better quality than the ones you obtained from the Orc Wolf Riders last time. I'm giving all of these to you for free." Phoebe held a clean piece of silk in her hands, carefully wiping away at the long sword in her hands as she spoke coldly to Han Shuo. Han Shuo played with the crossbow and dagger in his hands, so delighted with them that he could hardly bear to put them down. He was quite satisfied with Phoebe's generosity and said with a light laugh, "Don't count on me too much for this operation, I'm not as strong as you think I am. My main purpose is to keep a lookout and act as your supporting assistant. You're still going to be the one who has to take action. I know, just listen to my orders later. I'll be telling you what to do then." Phoebe rolled her eyes at Han Shuo and said with some anger. Han Shuo took out a small bottle from within his space ring and carefully poured some powder onto his fingertip, very cautiously coating the tips of both the dagger and crossbow bolts. He hastily and repeatedly cleaned the fingertip that had been covered by the powder. Phoebe was a bit curious about Han Shuo's actions and slightly shifted her body closer to where he was sitting, proceeding to stare at and observe his actions for quite a while. She finally asked, seemingly perplexed, "What are you doing?" A strand of fragrance, similar to the scent of orchids, wafted into Han Shuo's mouth and nose as Phoebe moved closer to him. He involuntarily flicked a glance at her as his heart suddenly lurched. Phoebe was like Han Shuo today, dressed in tight-fitting, black, Nightwalker clothes. The tight Nightwalker clothing caused Phoebe's marvelous body to become visible without a doubt. She had a pair of exquisitely chiseled cheeks, and stunning beauty which blossomed from the movement of her clear eyes. All of which caused Han Shuo to have a heart like a capering monkey and a mind like a galloping horse. I already have Fanny. Although this Phoebe is pretty, her personality is too cold and she comes with too much dangerous baggage. Han Shuo said silently to himself and turned his head away afterwards, continuing to concentrate on coating the dagger and crossbow bolts. He responded diffidently, "Nothing much, just applying some poison powder to my weapons." Despicable. Shameless. This goes against the regulations of the Empire. If anyone were to know of your actions, you would be in great trouble. Phoebe's face was full of contempt as she spoke coldly. Doesn't matter. What we're about to do today isn't the most honorable task anyways. Besides, no one will find out about this. Heh heh, you're my accomplice and even I don't believe that you're dumb enough to rat yourself out. Han Shuo cackled a low, evil laugh as he spoke with a trace of pride. Phoebe was a bit suffocated by her anger upon hearing Han Shuo's words, but since she had looked to him for help, she could only snort coldly and couldn't say much else. When Han Shuo had applied poison powder to all the crossbow bolt and his dagger, he thought for a moment and pulled a few iron needles from his thigh. He spared no trouble and was exceedingly patient as he also applied the same poison powder to the iron needles. Phoebe once again snorted lightly, seeming to hold Han Shuo's methods in high contempt. When he'd settled everything appropriately, Han Shuo put away all his weapons and looked at Phoebe, asking, "Right, why are you not directly attacking Grover and are attempting to kill his two ineffectual lackeys instead? Grover has some critical items belonging to the guild in his possession, he's put those items in a trusted mistress. If Grover dies, his mistress is sure to publicly reveal those items. This would be of destructive impact to us. So before I kill Grover, I must find his mistress first and regain control of those items." Phoebe glanced sideways at Han Shuo, explaining with some reluctance. The larger a merchant guild was, the more likely shady dealings would occur. Take the resources that Han Shuo had seized from the Orc Wolf Riders for example. These items had originally belonged to the shops of the town of Droll. The Empire had long since had an official regulation that if citizens obtained such resources, they must be turned in. Fabian and Han Shuo's transaction had already violated the Empire's regulations. If the Empire were to find out about the methods of the Buzzed Merchant Guild, the guild was sure to find it hard to escape their inevitable punishment. For a guild like the Buzzed Merchant Guild, there were surely more similarly illegal transactions. It looked like this critical matters was handled by Grover. No wonder Phoebe didn't dare to act rashly against Grover. The two discussed some of the details in low voices until the horse carriage suddenly stopped unbeknownst to anyone. The groom at the front said softly, "Miss, we've arrived at the back door of the guild. Let's go." Phoebe glanced at Han Shuo and took the lead in alighting. Han Shuo poked his head out to look around and then hopped off as well. "Miss, hurry inside. Be careful. Grover has just taken a few strong men and left the guild. I don't know where they've gone. They always return at the end of the night." An old man in the Buzzed Merchant Guild was guarding the back door and hastily turned his body to the side to allow Phoebe and Han Shuo to enter when he saw them arrive. "We've caused you to go to great efforts," Phoebe said to the old man. She glanced at Han Shuo as they rushed inside the guild. Han Shuo followed tightly behind Phoebe as he, too, quickly moved forward. "Although the guild is mostly controlled by Grover's men, I can mobilize a few older men, and this is all because Grover isn't aware of my relationship with them. There are many guards inside, so we must be careful and cautious. Otherwise, not only will the assassination fail if we're discovered, but it would be hard to even escape with our lives." Phoebe was exceedingly familiar with the Buzzed Merchant Guild as she evaded quite a few areas with guards when she led Han Shuo with a fast pace. She didn't forget to remind Han Shuo during this time. It was completely dark now. There was no moon tonight and thick layers of dark-colored clouds completely absorbed all light. The few lights along the hallways of the Buzzed Merchant Guild were unable to shine out too far. Phoebe had the strength of a swordmaster all right. Her agile body greatly surprised Han Shuo. Her body flew soundlessly and her speed was exceedingly fast. His magical yuan churning madly, Han Shuo was greatly astounded by the extraordinariness of his senses when he calmed down. The Black Knight was completely unable to obstruct his range of vision. Even without the illumination of lights, Han Shuo could clearly see the fish swimming in the pools beneath the artificial mountains in the far distance. He could also clearly hear the footsteps coming from quite a distance away and the rustlings of low voices within passing rooms. Han Shuo's calm walk was also agile and fast beyond comparison. He was like a hunting cheetah, searching for his prey, following soundlessly behind Phoebe. Suddenly, Han Shua quickly approached and grabbed Phoebe, abruptly hauling her body and stuffing themselves into a crack in the surrounding artificial mountains. The crack in the artificial mountains was exceedingly narrow, and their chests were tightly mashed against each other as they squeezed inside. Han Shua could feel the fully rounded peaks in front of Phoebe's chest. Her charming face was infuriated as she glared fiercely at Han Shua, her eyes seeming like they could spit out fire. Extending a finger to make a silencing motion, Han Shua's eyes rolled rapidly, indicating to Phoebe that there was an unexpected situation. The wrath on Phoebe's face still didn't dissipate upon Han Shua's actions. A trace of bashful red flooded Phoebe's slender, white neck and nape. Their two thighs were somewhat enmeshed and rubbing against each other, they could even feel each other's heartbeat through their connecting chests. A strand of ambiguous atmosphere started to emanate between the two of them. Seemingly too shy to look at Han Shua, Phoebe's cheek made its way next to Han Shua's ear as she said in an incredibly low voice, her breath like orchids, "I will kill you if there isn't anything going on." Han Shua's expression was wry as he regulated his breathing and concentrated, not saying anything. He felt the exceedingly light footsteps draw near. His breathing became slower and he even slightly shook his head, wanting to warn Phoebe of danger. Who knew that because Phoebe was pursing her jade lips in a low whisper to Han Shua's shake of his head actually caused Phoebe's tantalizing lips to directly plaster themselves onto Han Shua's cheeks. Just as Phoebe's breathing was uneasy and about to erupt into rage, Han Shua turned his head with extreme difficulty and used a very resolute gaze to tell Phoebe to be careful. Phoebe had the training of a swordmaster after all, and the strength of her mental state was quite strong. She merely inhaled a deep breath at this critical moment and immediately calmed her rapidly beating heart. However, because of her deep breath, the full peaks in front of her chest involuntarily lifted, rising so that Han Shua almost lost control and moaned. "My windscreen truly felt a disturbance and I came here at the fastest speed possible. Why didn't I discover anything? Have I been too careful lately?" The murmuring sound of a man talking to himself sounded out, not too far away from the two. Exceedingly light footsteps only slowly sounded in the vicinity after the voice came into earshot. If Phoebe hadn't raised her concentration to the utmost, it would have been exceedingly difficult to detect these footsteps unless the man had been quite close by. Since he was a wind mage, he could indeed use enhancement magics of the wind major to greatly decrease the weight of his body. His walking speed would be faster than normal mages and warriors, and his footsteps would be even more lithe with no sound. No wonder that even with Phoebe's strength as a swordmaster, she was able to detect his movement only after he drew near. This person surveyed the surroundings, finally departing without a sound while Han Shua and Phoebe remained on tenterhooks. However, Phoebe didn't dare take reckless actions this time. She was deathly afraid that her judgment would be flawed. Her pair of clear eyes bore straight into Han Shua, as if wishing to gain some clues from Han Shua's face. After a while, Han Shua exhaled lightly and said lowly, "He's gone." As soon as his voice sounded, Phoebe used her hands and legs together to firmly squirm out from the crack of the artificial mountains. She lowered her head and said lightly with a fierce tone, "I'll let it pass this time, but the next time something like this occurs, find a more spacious place, otherwise I won't let you off." Phoebe circled around the area after she'd finished speaking and was about to head in another direction. She walked 2 steps and realized that Han Shua was smiling wryly, having yet to catch up. She stuck her hands on her waist and lightly rebuked, "You don't want the black gold ore anymore." "Coming." Han Shua responded and followed with some resignation, thinking, when can I find a spacious hiding place when things go south? They didn't meet with any more unexpected twists afterwards. Phoebe led Han Shua on a longer path, avoiding a few waves of guards and finally making it into Darnell and Yuna's room. "Let's set things up, make our preparations, and wait for this dog couple to come back." Phoebe immediately spoke through gritted teeth upon entering the room, seeming to want to vent her frustrations from earlier on the two of them. Therefore, Han Shua and Phoebe started working busily, preparing to assassinate Grover's loyal lackeys who were about to return. Chapter 72. An alarmingly breathtaking completion of an assassination. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Phoebe and Han Shoa had set up the room accordingly after a while. Why were you able to so miraculously discover traces of the Wind Mage Ellis when he made his way over? Phoebe creased her brow, perplexed, and looked at Han Shoa in inquiry as she was inspecting the inside of the room. Han Shoa was stooped close to the ground at this moment and carefully collected some sawdust from scraps of wood. He conscientiously stored it within his space ring and responded without lifting his head. "This is my business and has nothing to do with you." Snorting lightly, Phoebe shut her mouth, but couldn't help but observe Han Shoa's actions after a while. She gave an involuntary cry of astonishment. "Were you a killer before? How come you are so steady and cautious right now, and even possess such extraordinary perception?" If it was Han Shoa's original personality, he naturally wouldn't face any matter with such a steady and cautious mentality, but his magical training forced him to continually exist in a state of enduring inhumane pain, unconsciously creating Han Shoa's firm and indomitable personality. After the trials of the Dark Forest and Claude's death, Han Shoa's careful prudence and steadiness had been unconsciously and soundlessly trained into being. Add to that his extraordinary perception, this truly gave Han Shoa the characteristics of a professional killer. No wonder Phoebe would dare to ask. "No, do you think I'm you? Tonight, I've been operating under your watchful instructions ever since we entered the guild up until our preparations just now. I think that you certainly wouldn't have grasped such methods if it weren't for certain experiences. Looks like you were the one who was a killer before, otherwise why would you be so well practiced?" Han Shoa finally cleared the sawdust from the bed panels and raised his head to rake Phoebe with his eyes. "You're the one who was a killer before." Phoebe rolled her eyes coldly at Han Shoa. She continued to say, "However, my honored master has passed on to me knowledge of these matters. The particulars of assassinating someone was also one of my required subjects of study." "Oh. Looks like your master was a very proficient killer," Han Shoa said diffidently. "Shut your mouth, don't you dare slander my honored master. My honored master is a true swordsman. He wouldn't do such things." Phoebe's face was even colder as she glared ferociously at Han Shoa. It was at this moment that faint footsteps could be heard approaching from afar. Han Shoa's brow knitted as he carefully discerned them. He said to Phoebe, "They should be coming back, I can hear them." Phoebe also focused on her hearing and listened. She only heard the sound of footsteps draw near a few breaths after Han Shoa's warning had sounded. She looked at him in shock and said in a low voice, "No matter how strong or weak your strength is, you're already quite frightening just based on your foresight and extraordinary senses." Han Shoa didn't respond and moved according to Phoebe's earlier instructions. He crouched down, turned to the side, and rolled underneath the bed. Upon seeing that Han Shoa was in position, Phoebe scanned the four corners of the room with her beautiful eyes and suddenly sprang upwards. Leveraging the chandelier in the room, she hid herself in the shadows of the rafters. Holding his breath and concentrating, Han Shoa slowed down the frequency of his breaths and heart rate, until he appeared to be dead. His mind completely clear, Han Shoa rifled through his mind, going over the items they had set up in the room once more in his mind, then placing all of his concentration on the people arriving. At this moment, footsteps sounded at a volume in which even normal people could hear. The coy laughter of a man and woman flirting sounded from far out the room door, accompanied by various sounds of them making out. The room door creaked open as the two of them slowly walked in, slowly approaching the bed under which Han Shoa was concealed. "Darling, were you feeling that itchy today that you had to be so wild at the banquet tonight? Who's caught your eye now?" Darnell laughed softly as he teased Yuna. "What's my business is mine. Are you a beast that only knows how to think with your lower body? You only have that B*TCH Phoebe in your heart now. If it wasn't for you wanting to do something last time, we would have completed Grover's mission and killed that B*TCH. Her guards got there in time because of your mistake, we almost didn't get out in time. Yuna berated Darnell. She'd already sat down on the edge of the bed. Heh, her skin is as smooth as silk and her face seems like it was exquisitely sketched by a painter. It said that she hasn't had a man yet. Wouldn't it be such a pity for her if such a beauty doesn't experience the manliness of my strength before she dies? Darnell leered. At this moment, Han Shua's concentration had been raised to the utmost. Although Darnell and Yuna couldn't detect Phoebe waiting in ambush, Han Shua could hear her heartbeat and breathing quicken. It looked like she was exceedingly furious. He gave an internal start of surprise and concealed himself even more carefully, ready to act, in case Phoebe sprang the ambush earlier than planned. Damned lecher, you'll die beneath the crotch of a woman someday. Heh, I'll let you die beneath my crotch first. The shifting sounds of clothes being taken off slowly spread throughout the room, mixed in with Darnell's depraved laughter and Yuna's light panting sounds. Sucking and kissing sounds followed after as Darnell's depraved laughter and Yuna's moans grew louder and louder. The wooden bed above Han Shua's head became a small boat in the midst of large waves as it rocked endlessly. A wailing moan, like someone crying, suddenly emerged from Yuna's mouth, followed by the sounds of repeated smacking sounds and heavy pants filling the ears, mixed in with Yuna's uncontrollable wails in between. Beneath the bed, Han Shua could hear the sounds from above and could feel the bed swaying. He knew, without needing to see, that the depraved couple above him had started their battle. His blood boiling, Han Shua couldn't help but imagine the scene going on just above him, and he desperately wanted to climb out and take a good look. His body had long since uncontrollably risen in a certain male fashion. An exceedingly light breathing sound came within Han Shua's earshot. He started, and immediately detected that this sound came from Phoebe, who was still up in the rafters. He wondered if she was furious or also similarly affected. Han Shua could only hear the sounds from beneath the bed, whereas Phoebe had to continuously keep an eye on the two. She probably had caught a huge eyeful of their motions. Because even the slightest break in concentration wouldn't be allowed during an assassination operation, Phoebe couldn't even move her gaze away from the two. According to Darnell's words, Phoebe was still a maiden. This type of stimulus was probably more effective to her than to Han Shua, who was stuck underneath the bed and unable to see anything that was going on. After a while, just as Han Shua noticeably heard Phoebe's breathing hitch higher and was afraid that she would be unable to further conceal herself, but the movements of the depraved couple above him became more and more intense. Enormous panting and moaning sounds grew louder as the movement of the bed frame grew bigger. Things had obviously reached the climax. Just at this moment, a light sound pierced the air. Han Shua's entire body tensed when it sounded, immediately knowing that Phoebe had already made her move. He focused all the concentration in his body. Ow! Yuna cried out in pain and abruptly yelled out, "Assassin!" Before Yuna has even finished saying the word assassin, the dagger in Han Shua's hand was already aimed at a hole that had been previously bored through the bed frame, and he stabbed it ferociously through the hole. A ghastly wail 10 times more desolate than Yuna's suddenly sounded out from Darnell's mouth, like a pig being slaughtered. The minds of the two quickly cleared up from the original heights that they had almost scaled. They screamed continuously as they jumped from the bed and made for the room outside, the cries of agony never once ceased to flow from their mouths. Han Shua had already rolled out from beneath the bed after his stab. He raised his head to see that Phoebe's body was enveloped by the black Nightwalker cloak, and that a ball of milky white aura was flaring out from the longsword in her hand. The ball of aura was lustrous and brilliant in the dimness of the room. It dazzled so brightly that one could barely keep their eyes open, and it closed in on Darnell and Yuna, who were attempting to make their escape. Han Shua lifted the crossbow in his hand and realized that both were completely naked when he aimed and fired at Darnell. There was already a crossbow bolt stuck on Yuna's snow-white left thigh, and she gritted her teeth with pain as she moved. Her body was obviously not as agile as before. Darnell was even worse off, as the lower half of his body was a mess of blood and flesh. He wore a devastated expression of tragedy, wailing continuously like a wolf. Who would have thought that this dagger would stab directly into Darnell's private parts? No wonder his cries were a lot more desolate than Yuna's, Han Shoa thought in happy viciousness. The crossbow bolt flew out like lightning and shot towards Darnell's back. Darnell could actually still detect the danger from behind him when he was in the throes of horror and fright. Dark green light flared from the long sword he had long since wielded and demolished Han Shoa's crossbow bolt with an abrupt spin. A wall of water suddenly appeared after a hastily muttered incantation. The dark blue wall of water enveloped their two heads and turned Phoebe's milky white fighting aura into a sky full of rain, watering their two bodies. But the appearance of this wall of water was timely and won a few seconds of time for the two. The two screamed and ran for the outside of the room, but halfway through the room, the hanging chandelier suddenly crashed down, forcing Darnell to halt his steps again and smash the chandelier to the side. Phoebe had already descended from the rafters by this time and Han Shoa had just fired his crossbow. They rushed the two at the same time like cheetahs. Phoebe had planned on finishing off Darnell, but displayed a trace of panic and disgust when she saw his naked body. She shifted her sights and longsword to Yuna. The crossbow in Han Shoa's hand fired again and was then flung to the side. Just when Darnell had demolished the crossbow bolt, Han Shoa's dagger was already rushing to greet him. Darnell had already sunken into a crazed frenzy and due to the pain and heartache of losing his manhood, he increased his fighting aura to the maximum and clashed with Han Shoa's dagger. PFFSHT. A mouthful of fresh blood splurted out as Darnell's wild fighting aura rushed into Han Shoa's body. Although he had the restraints of the magical Yuan, it still wasn't enough to fully defend against it. Han Shoa stumbled a few steps backwards after that clash. Upon seeing Han Shoa hastily retreat after clashing with this sword, Darnell wanted to crazily pursue Han Shoa, but he suddenly discovered that the long sword in his hand was boiling hot and that the skin of the right hand that was grasping the sword was suffering from extreme burning pain. He immediately flung out the long sword in his shock. Hurry and run. Yuna called out at this moment. A water serpent had appeared at some time and had surrounded Phoebe, attacking fiercely. Except, part of its body would be severed whenever Phoebe waved her sword, turning into watery mist before it even hit the floor. Darnell glared viciously at Han Shoa, but didn't pursue him further. He covered his lower body with his left hand and continued rushing out the door. At this moment, Han Shoa's ears caught the sound of faint footsteps coming from afar. Agitated internally, he once again rushed towards the two. Phoebe had also destroyed the water serpent by now and chased the two with speed that was on par with Han Shoa's. Han Shoa and Phoebe both understood that if they didn't kill these two now, they would no longer have the chance to once they left the room. Therefore, they strived with all their might to keep the two in the room. At this moment, a prearranged prop was curiously effective. Han Shoa had made some modifications to the table legs of a round table set in front of the door. In their unparalleled haste, the two didn't circle around the round table, but actually leaped towards it, intending to use it as a lever to quickly leave the room. The unexpected happened. Their two bodies landed on the table, and the table legs all broke with a sharp crack as they were unable to hold the weight of the two bodies that had suddenly landed on it. The two of them had already used all their strength to begin with, planning on using the table as a stepping stone to push off of, but the table collapse caused their bodies to lose balance. With the sudden lack of a support, their bodies followed the table in a wobbly fall. Han Shoa and Phoebe had both arrived at this moment. Phoebe's sword stabbed out, her aura already enclosing the two. The two had just regained their balance when they saw that they had been fully surrounded by Phoebe's fighting aura. Darnell suddenly pulled Yuna and, under her terrified and panic-stricken eyes, thrust her straight into Phoebe's attack. He didn't even turn back to look at Yuna as he gave no second thoughts about anything else, rushing out of the room. However, the poison powder that Han Shoa had applied to the dagger finally took effect. Darnell's footsteps suddenly became as heavy as 1,000 tons after he took 2 steps. Han Shoa swiftly closed the distance before he had time to react and waved the dagger again, taking his life. After killing Darnell, Han Shoa's eyes fell on the space ring on Darnell's fingers. He reached his hand out for it, but felt that it took a bit of effort to do so. Time was of the essence and Han Shoa ended up chopping off Darnell's middle finger with a slash of the dagger. He put away the finger with the space ring and turned his head to see that a bloody hole had opened in Yuna's chest. Phoebe seemed to have killed her. "Let's go." Han Shoa called out softly, rushing to Phoebe's side. A light fragrance suddenly emanated from Yuna and Phoebe's direction. Han Shoa took in a breath, but paid it no heed. He only saw that the look in Phoebe's eyes were a bit strange, and rushed at the girl, who was staring off into space. He used the same method to break off the ring finger on Yuna's left hand, taking her space ring as well. He grabbed the crossbows that had been discarded with a smooth motion, and grabbed Phoebe, and with a mighty leap, using a hole that had opened in the roof previously, and made their escape along the roof. Chapter 73. Pervert, what have you done to me? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Around midnight, Han Shoa and Phoebe had just left when Grover brought a pack of buzzed Merchant Guild guards and barged into the room. "Who did it? Who did it? I've spent so many gold coins to keep you guys in vain. Not a single one of you discovered that an assassin had snuck in. If the target was me, then it likely wouldn't be those 2 on the ground." Grover immediately started bawling furiously upon entering the room, yelling at the people behind him. "Mr. Grover, this assassin was very proficient. He managed to avoid my wind wall and assassinated both Darnell and Yuna in such a short amount of time. This proves that the killer's strength is absolutely beyond our imagination." A mage with long hair and a somewhat ugly expression said to Grover after observing for a while. Exhaling lightly, Grover looked at the long-haired mage and said in an apologetic tone, "My apologies Ellis, I was a bit out of line." The wind mage Ellis was still expressionless, and looked at the dead Darnell's left hand with some surprise. He went, and walked up to the body, noticing that the left hand was missing a finger. Ellis asked, perplexed, "The left middle finger, on which Darnell wears his space ring, has been chopped off. What's going on? Not only Darnell, but Yuna as well. Could it be that this killer killed them because he wanted to rob them?" Grover was also a bit confused and asked after hearing Ellis' words. "Impossible." Ellis denied decisively and looked around the surroundings, explaining. "If the assassins wished to kill them for the sole purpose of robbing them, then he never would have picked these 2, because the 2 of them together are the most difficult to fight against. Not to mention there are many valuable items within the guild. If he only wanted valuables, he wouldn't have needed to do anything to them. With the abilities demonstrated by the killer, he absolutely could have obtained more from the guild without making a single sound." Grover thought for a bit after his words and nodded. He said with a darkened face, "If he wasn't in it to murder for gain, then it must have been thanks to my dear niece Phoebe. It seems like she finally couldn't bear it longer after enduring things for so long. Indeed, Phoebe must be behind this. Darnell and Yuna both tried to assassinate Phoebe once. Although they retreated when they didn't succeed, I feel that Phoebe must know that it was the 2 of them." After all, Darnell's gaze towards Phoebe was simply too lecherous and unique. Even I, an outsider, could tell. As the one involved, Phoebe must have had an even better understanding of things. The fact that we're fine, and they're the only ones who have died is enough to explain things. Except, it seems that the killer is a bit greedy. Otherwise he wouldn't have remembered to take their space rings in such dangerous circumstances. When did such a character appear beside Phoebe? Ellis furrowed his brow and said slowly while turning things over in his mind. Grover started and mused deeply for a while. His face suddenly darkened and he said coldly, "I know who. It must be that Brian who killed those 3 assassins from Shadow Ghost a while back. I heard the guard say that this person came to do some business with Fabian and thus needed some money. Since his strength is enough to kill 3 of the senior swordsmen sent by Shadow Ghost, then he would have the strength to kill Darnell and Yuna. Damn it, how did Phoebe get her hands on this kid? I don't know where Phoebe's hidden him. He hasn't appeared by Phoebe's side since he left the guild last time. I've sent people to surveil where he is, but have still been unable to find traces of him. This will be quite difficult. Nodding, Ellis concluded. Looks like it is him. I think we should get rid of this person first at all costs. Otherwise we may be killed by him in due time. Alright, pass my orders on, not to kill Phoebe for now. Put forth all effort into finding this person. He's ruined my plans twice, and I'm going to make his existence a living hell. Grover's face was sinister as he spoke coldly. At this moment, Han Shoa, deeply hated by Grover, had already brought Phoebe far away from the Buzzed Merchant Guild and was rushing towards Phoebe's quarters in the northern part of the city. Something was odd with Phoebe, as she seemed a bit out of it. Her body was sluggish and hot to the touch. Han Shoa was dragging her in his haste to cover distance. The two of them were dressed in Nightwalker clothes and chose to thread through small alleyways in the dark of the night, staying completely out of sight. But as they neared the northern part of the city guards started appearing more frequently, forcing Han Shoa to continuously hide and evade. Phoebe had still known to make good time when dragged behind Han Shoa, but at this moment, her steps started to drag as her body grew hotter and hotter. With no alternatives, Han Shoa flung Phoebe onto his back, completely disregarding whether or not she agreed. In order to avoid the attention of the city guard, Han Shoa temporarily gave up his idea to send Phoebe back to her quarters and took her to the cemetery behind the Babylon Academy of School and Magic instead. It was the quietest place he knew, and no one patrolled there. Add to that, Han Shoa was exceedingly familiar with the area, and that was why this was the first place he thought of in a time of crisis like this. When Han Shoa had circled past the northern part of the city with Phoebe on his back and made it past some narrow roads into a forest patch, he suddenly felt that Phoebe, on his back, was tearing at her own clothes and her 2 hands were roving unconsciously over Han Shoa's body. Astonished, Han Shoa's body suddenly stopped. After relaxing, Han Shoa could clearly feel the well-rounded mounds in front of Phoebe's chest pressed against his back, the wondrous sensation of them closely mashed against his well-defined back. A blaze of fire suddenly ignited from his chest, uncontrollable like the sparks of a fire. Add to that Phoebe's restless hands were still unconsciously moving all over Han Shoa's chest, and it finally grew so stimulating, that Han Shoa could no longer control himself. He swung Phoebe down from his back and suddenly held her marvelous body in his hands. He thrust Phoebe's body onto a tree nearby, and Han Shoa's 2 hands moved in tandem, meeting the forbidden areas of Phoebe's body. Envied at even with the Nightwalker clothes separating them, Han Shoa could feel the wondrous curves of Phoebe's bodies. Her well-rounded chest kept changing shape beneath Han Shoa's ministrations, and when his hand roamed over Phoebe's slender legs and pert bottom, the amazing, strong stimulus attacked Han Shoa's senses, making him want to experience it even deeper. Phoebe had yanked her own face mask off, and at this moment her eyes were glassy, filled with the tempting lure of desire. Her stunningly beautiful face burned to the touch and brought with it a heart-leaping beauty. The faint fragrance emitted by the breaths between her open mouth made Han Shoa's heart caper like a monkey and mind gallop like a horse. He was about to lose himself in it entirely. Han Shoa's right hand tore off a piece of Phoebe's Nightwalker outfit near the chest. The snow-white expanse of her breasts immediately blossomed in front of Han Shoa's eyes, along with a dot of pinkish red. Han Shoa finally couldn't contain himself and he lost control of the strength in his right hand. Oh! Ow! At this moment, a small, feeble protest came out from Phoebe's small mouth. Her beautiful brows quirked vaguely because of the pain coming from her breasts, finally unconsciously mouthing a weak sign of pain. Calmness blindsiding his mind, Han Shoa abruptly came to his senses. When he looked at Phoebe, he also recalled that he too had taken in a breath of that odd scent earlier. He immediately understood that Phoebe had fallen victim to an aphrodisiac, and also reflected that his loss of rational thought was likely because he had taken in a breath of the same toxin. His thoughts spinning furiously, Han Shuo measured up his potential gains and losses and resolutely gathered Phoebe in his arms again, furiously dashing out to the front. Han Shuo was very familiar with this area and came to a winding creek after not too long. The creek was quite narrow, and he wasn't sure where it led to either, but he knew that this river was very shallow due to often frequenting in the area. As soon as he reached the river, Han Shuo walked directly into the waters, still holding Phoebe. Because it was almost winter, the weather was exceedingly frigid. The river waters were even more icy in the middle of the night, and when Han Shuo carried Phoebe into the water and splashed some water onto her head, Phoebe suddenly sneezed a few times. Han Shuo also submerged his head into water, and when the ice-cold water covered his head, it chilled his previous urges. His body's reactions also completely calmed down. Achoo! Achoo! After Phoebe sneezed a few times, her mind slowly came back to her senses due to the effects of the cold river water. When she spat the cold water out of her mouth, the blush on her cheeks slowly disappeared and her glassy stare slowly disappeared. Where is this, why I am here? Achoo! Phoebe looked around in confusion and sneezed again. When she lowered her head to sneeze, Phoebe abruptly realized that the two well-rounded peaks of her chest were exposed to the night air. The snow-white expanse of her skin and the dots of red at the peak greatly affected Phoebe. Pa! Han Shuo's face had already suffered from a slap. Phoebe's face held anger that was almost madness in its ferocity as she screamed shrilly at Han Shuo, "Pervert, what have you done to me?" Han Shuo truly did feel a bit apologetic towards Phoebe at this moment, and he stammered, unable to speak clearly as he gazed upon a girl who was about to lose her mind. Phoebe suddenly broke out in loud sobs when she saw Han Shuo's reaction, instantly losing her usual cold arrogance and demureness. She gave no thought to anything else and began beating at Han Shuo with her fists and feet. Water splashed every which way in the creek and drenched Han Shuo. But because Phoebe had suffered from such a great shock at this moment that she seemed to have completely forgotten that she was a strong swordmaster. She was more like a bad-tempered shrew, beating Han Shuo in a disorganized fashion without any fighting aura whatsoever. If Phoebe had used fighting aura, with her strength as a swordmaster, even with Han Shuo's small accomplishments in magic, would cause him to be gravely injured, if not dead after her string of blows, but these types of attacks felt like scratching an itch when they landed on Han Shuo's strong body, not hurting in the slightest. Han Shuo endured Phoebe's venting with a wry expression. When the strength behind her fists decreased more and more and she herself became tired, Han Shuo laughed wryly, "We were both under the influence of an aphrodisiac, but your body is still clean." Phoebe came to her senses after Han Shuo spoke and halted the motions of her hands. She stood in front of Han Shuo with a distance spanning 2 fists, sizing him up with slightly puffy eyes, as if afraid to endure another shock. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Truly? You really didn't do that to me?" Nodding his head firmly, Han Shuo held up his right hand in resignation and solemnly promised her, "I swear that I really didn't do anything inappropriate to you." A trace of relieved joy suddenly appeared on Phoebe's beautiful, tear-streaked face. She was about to open her mouth and say something when she suddenly saw the nudity of her chest and hastily pulled the Nightwalker outfit up, covering her naked breasts. She lifted a head full of anger and glared at Han Shuo, roaring lowly through gritted teeth, "Then can you explain to me why the front of my clothes were ripped open?" Shrugging his shoulders, Han Shuo said with a face full of innocence. "What does that have to do with me? You're the one who lost your mind and started ripping off your clothes. I controlled myself tightly and brought you here, using cold water to revive your senses. I am an honorable gentleman, don't misunderstand me." "Screw your honorable gentlemanliness, you despicable, shameless, profit-seeking knave. You held my hand last time and hugged me without even a word of apology. You purposely took advantage of me in the crack of the artificial mountains in the guild and didn't apologize. You've gone even further now, I'm going to chase you to the depths of hell for this. Phoebe's face was full of wrath as she made threatening gestures and rushed at Han Shuo. Phoebe had obviously activated her fighting aura after coming to her senses this time. Han Shuo was startled and knew that Phoebe had most likely remembered her clothes being torn in front of her was from his hands. He hastily turned and scrambled up the river bank, protesting his innocence along the way. Miss Phoebe, listen to me. I also took in a breath of the aphrodisiac, causing my emotions to get out of control, but when I came to myself I immediately took you to this river. The heavens and earth are my witness, I really didn't take advantage of you. When you were still under the influence, you also touched me all over and took advantage of me. Apart from you, no other girl has ever touched me before. I'm still a virgin. I'll have scars deep in my heart after being violated by you. I've also suffered losses, let's say that we're even for this matter. Don't pursue it any further. As Han Shuo ran away bedraggedly, words shot out of his mouth like bullets. It was as if he'd returned to the time when Chutsang Lan had brought him to the moon and he'd let the old man have it with his words when Han Shuo lost his composure. Except, it was insults last time, and explanations this time. Shut up, you petty villain who should die 1,000, 10,000 times. Stop saying nonsense. Phoebe's clothes were drenched through at this time and her wet hair exuded another type of allure, but her motions with her sword in her hands were quite violent. Forget it, count me unlucky. I'll be leaving now and will come find you for the black gold or after you've calmed down. Farewell. Han Shuo knew that there was no use in talking to Phoebe at this time. A woman who'd lost her senses was the scariest magical creature in the world, not to mention one who was a swordswoman. The danger of this to Han Shuo was on par with that of a super magical creature, like a dragon. Sighing inside about how unlucky he was, Han Shuo didn't dare slow down his footsteps as he quickly rushed out, making for the direction of the cemetery and slowly leaving Phoebe, who was unfamiliar with the terrain, far behind. Chapter 74. The Little Skeleton That Wants to Soar and Fly. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The first glimmers of dawn appeared in the sky after using the transportation matrix to return to the cemetery of death. One full day and night had elapsed since his departure, and he hastened to move to the original demon cave and infuse more fresh blood and magical yuan, finally breathing a sigh of relief after he did so. The operation of the original demon cave must not be halted for even a day. If fresh blood and magical yuan weren't infused every day, then the work of the previous 20-some-odd days would be in vain. Planting his butt firmly on the ground, the fighting aura that had rushed into his body from Darnell's blow finally slowly started rampaging through his body. A sudden impact brought an upwelling of blood to Han Shuo's throat, he almost spat out a mouthful of fresh blood again. Happy instead of startled, he abruptly stood up and threw his head back in laughter. He quickly strode out of the cemetery of death, towards the waterfall that he used to train his magic. Han Shuo braved the long river rushing down and sat down in his usual place. His body wobbling strongly in the beginning, Han Shuo quickly sank again into his training mode. For the next 7 days, apart from infusing the original demon cave with fresh blood and magical yuan at periodic intervals, Han Shuo stayed beneath the waterfall to train his magic. Han Shuo's strength improved in spades in the midst of harsh training. Leveraging the fighting aura that Darnell had left within his body in the violent force of the waterfall, Han Shuo reforged the meridians and bones of his chest, waist, and stomach. When Han Shuo felt that Darnell's fighting aura no longer remained within him, he could clearly feel that his own body had emerged in an unprecedentedly better state. In the next few days, Han Shuo halted all magical training and spent his time looking after the original demon cave and studying the beginner magics of necromancy. He was now fully able to recite the latter from memory, and had basically committed it to memory. Han Shuo had noted the parts in which he didn't understand. As he continued to use the round, green ball to meditate, his mental strength grew with each passing day. Under his continual experimentation, he finally released the agony of the soul magic one day. Han Shuo was overjoyed and elated at that time. He understood that over the accumulation of several months and his greatly increased mental strength, he had finally graduated from the ranks of magic apprentice to being a novice mage. A novice mage in necromancy could grasp the three magics of agony of the soul, summon zombies, and bone spears. Except after trying for quite a while, Han Shuo had only happened to cast agony of the soul by mistake. He was unable to release the other two magics of summoning zombies and bone spears no matter how he tried. He connected that fact to the other of not being able to understand many parts of the beginner magics of necromancy. Han Shuo understood that only perusing books was not the fastest nor best way to increase his knowledge of magic. It looked like he should look for Fanny and inquire about the areas he didn't understand, as well as pick up the weapon forging materials that Phoebe had promised him, along with the black gold ore. But before he'd return, Han Shuo still planned to finishing refining the original demon. The original demon cave had been operating for a full 34 days and would be complete in 2 more days. Han Shuo was in no rush to leave immediately, and thus went to the dwarves' village to socialize with them. He came back to the mining cave again and mined for the entire day, obtaining a small piece of black iron ore and a couple pieces of iron and copper ore. Han Shuo understood from Phoebe that black iron ore was a very rare and very valuable ore. He could often only obtain a very small piece after mining for an entire day. Therefore, he directly stored the black iron ore within his space ring. When he returned to the cemetery of death afterwards, he threw all the iron and bronze ores into a space storage room within the Great Hall. This is interesting indeed. With these 3 original demons, I have 3 extra pairs of eyes. If I let them loose, I will no longer be afraid of being followed and ambushed. If I use the 3 original demons to assassinate others, it'll be an absolute nightmare for my enemies. Han Shuo laughed wildly as he repeatedly used his will to release and withdraw the original demons from and into his body, practicing tirelessly. At this moment, the little skeleton, that had been lying in the original demon cave all along, suddenly stood up, slowly climbing out of the pit. The 7 bone spurs on its back actually started flapping furiously as its body shot towards the sky with a strong push from its legs. The 7 bone spurs on its back were divided into 2 rows, like the wings of an insect, with the remaining one pointing down at its butt like a tail. As it shot towards the air, it capered shakily, with the 2 rows of bone spurs whirring furiously and its tail wagging continuously. It seemed to be the steering wheel of a bike in helping him move agilely through thin air. When the tail-like bone spur moved to the left, the little skeleton's body would also shift to the left. When the bone spur waved to the right, the little skeleton's body would fall to the right. It looked quite amazing. Han Shuo was gobsmacked as he looked at the little skeleton descend in a wobbling fall, his face full of shock. He didn't know how to react in the span of that moment. After a while, the little skeleton fell from midair with a crack as the bones of its body emitted a long string of creaking sounds. The little skeleton seemed to be dazed from the fall as it staggered around in circles after picking itself and the bone dagger up, as if it was drunk. Damn brat, you've only learned how to walk for a few days and now you want to fly. Han Shuo felt a deep pain in his heart as he looked at the little skeleton's current state. He hastily walked up to the little skeleton and knocked on the little skeleton's bright, smooth forehead. An interesting thing happened. When Han Shuo knocked down with his finger, the little skeleton immediately stopped its drunken staggering and sat down hard like a child. It even extended a finger to scratch its head, seemingly unable to comprehend what it did wrong. Han Shuo had protected the little skeleton with great care ever since first being summoned by Han Shuo. Under the continual refinement of his magical yuan, it started to display human-like behaviors. Han Shuo's feelings towards the little skeleton was far more than those he felt for anyone else in this world. He was worried to death when he saw it fall from high up in the air. Han Shuo breathed a sigh of relief when he verified, with his own eyes, that the little skeleton hadn't shattered, and that it had only been rattled by the fall with nothing else worse for the wear. After looking over it carefully, he suddenly realized that a few specks of dark red could be found within the inky blackness of the little skeleton's originally dark bones. It was no longer that pure, deep black. If it wasn't for his careful gaze, he likely would have been hard-pressed to discover it. This is strange. The original demon cave was original meant to refine a small demon chief. He purposefully squirmed his way in and even had an expression of leisurely enjoyment. His body had undergone some changes as soon as he left the pit, and even wanted to imitate those demon generals in my body and fly. Looks like this brat has changed again. I wonder if these changes are for the better or for the worse. Even I don't know what this brat is now. Han Shuo carefully stared at the little skeleton in close observation and muttered to himself. After a round of deep musings, in which Han Shuo realized that he couldn't understand the little skeleton's changes, he shook his head and thought no further. Looking at the now normal, original demon cave, since the original demon general had emerged from it, Han Shuo started an incantation and sent the little skeleton back to the other dimension. With his injuries recovered and the 3 original demons refined, and even the little skeleton recovering its mobility, Han Shuo traveled back to Asan City through the transportation matrix when he thought of the incomprehensible magical knowledge and the black gold ore that Phoebe owed him for his services. Chapter 75. Close the doors, you get in bed first. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Asan City, the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. Han Shuo ate breakfast and first bought a set of new clothes, arriving at the academy later in the morning. He went to the library first and surreptitiously put back the 2 books of The Foundations of Necromancy and A Magical Dictionary that he had asked Jack to steal before. He then walked to Fanny's lab. The doors to the lab were open and Fanny was wearing black robes trimmed with gold, wearing a set of black framed glasses and holding a magic staff in her left hand. She held a pen in her right and was drawing some magical patterns on the pedestal in the center, explaining something with her speech. Next to her, Fitch had put on the appearance of conscientious listening, but his eyes often traveled over Fanny's face. Fanny had lost a few traces of her charming beauty with glasses on, but gained solemnness and the beauty of intellectuality. In Han Shuo's eyes, her beauty wasn't diminished at all, and he rather stared soulfully at her, mesmerized. Fanny delivered a string of words, then lifted her head to look at Fitch, who was busy staring off into space. She frowned. Fitch, do you understand? L.RG. Fitch suddenly woke up from his musings and nodded, smiling. Master Fanny, you were very clear, I understand. When Fanny lifted her head to look at Fitch, she happened to see Han Shuo standing in front of the door. Han Shuo was now a bit taller than Fitch, and his body was muscular and well-defined due to continuous training and fighting. He stood there with his spine straight, like a javelin, without the slightest bit of the usual, frail external appearance that mages usually possessed. Fanny first blinked, a bit astonished by Han Shuo's unnoticed changes, but when Fanny also saw Han Shuo staring at her, mesmerized, her heart gave a leap and her face blushed red as well. Her right hand tightened on the pen and almost snapped the pen in 2. What's wrong with me? Fanny said to herself and involuntarily took a deep breath, seeming to pout as she glared at Han Shuo. She lifted her head to call out, long time no see Brian. You've disappeared for a month after last time's training. Where have you been skulking around for so long that you only remembered to return now? Han Shuo's mentality immediately returned to normal after hearing Fanny's words. He laughed lightly, not waiting for her to greet him, and strode purposefully into the room. He responded, last time's outing in the dark forest made me realize the many deficiencies in my abilities. That's why I borrowed a magic book and did some remedial studying on the foundational knowledge of magic. I've come to Master Fanny with some questions because I've encountered many difficulties. Ha! Who would believe you? You're always so mysterious. Fanny rolled her eyes at Han Shuo, obviously not believing his words. She turned her head to look at Fitch, suddenly feeling that his presence was irritating, for some inexplicable reason. She instructed, "Fitch, I have a few more matters to discuss privately with Brian. Since you understood my explanation, you can go back and practice well." Fitch started. He hadn't seemed to think that Fanny would want him to leave because of Han Shua's appearance. He blanked for a while, then finally viciously glared at Han Shua, saying lowly, "Errand slaves will always be errand slaves. It's not like you've become a real student just because you put on the uniform." Fitch finally left after saying this. A smile was constantly apparent on Han Shua's face, completely oblivious to Fitch's low mutterings. Han Shua knew this was because of Fanny's attitude towards Fitch that caused Fitch to carry a grudge, but until Fitch took action to express his hatred, Han Shua couldn't be bothered to spend an ounce of strength on him. "Go and close the door tightly." Fanny put down the pen and raked Han Shua with her gaze, instructing in an imposing manner as soon as Fitch had left. "Close the doors." Han Shua's heart jumped, gazing upon Fanny with a deep and meaningful look. He displayed a trace of an odd smile, hastily got up, and hastened to say, all right, I'll go close the doors." When Han Shua had jubilantly and gleefully closed the doors to the lab, Fanny raked Han Shua with another gaze and continued instructing, "Get on the bed first." Nodding his head like a chicken pecking corn, Han Shua didn't even bother saying much this time and directly shucked off his shoes, falling directly backwards on the white bed. He proudly crossed his legs and smiled, "Master Fanny, you come over as well." Fanny watched Han Shua with an amused expression as her mouth closed with an audible click. "Come, close your eyes first." He had never been so docile as Han Shua obediently closed his eyes, thinking dirty thoughts. A depraved smile blossomed on his face. "Ah!" A painful howl emitted from Han Shua's mouth. He suddenly felt that a large surge of mental strength had invaded his mind, completely startlingly Han Shua from his beautiful dreams. When Han Shua saw that Fanny was gazing at him with a small smile, he asked with a hint of anger in his voice, "Master Fanny, what are you doing?" "Examining your body. Didn't I say last time that you're the subject of my experiments, and that I would use the school facilities to conduct a thorough examination on you when we return to the school, like I've just done? What did you think I wanted to do with you after closing the doors and make you lie on the bed?" Fanny spoke with a face full of seriousness and glared at Han Shua, but even with glasses on, they couldn't hide the proud smile in her eyes, one that was proud of successfully executing her scheme. The Han Shua of now was not the Han Shua of before. He immediately discerned the joy in Fanny's eye with one glance. He sat up with a wry smile and said, "Forget it, don't examine me in the future. These things can't be explained by rational logic. If you truly turn me into an idiot by intruding my mind that way, my life will be over." Fanny vaguely creased her brow in thought upon hearing Han Shua's words and sighed involuntarily after a bit of contemplation. She smiled, "Forget it then. I'm willing to lose an experimental subject, but not a talented student." Seeing that Fanny was letting him off the hook so easily, Han Shua heaved a huge sigh of relief and immediately thanked Fanny sincerely. He then took out the book of Beginner Magics of Necromancy, and started asking Fanny all the parts he didn't understand. Upon seeing Han Shua withdraw the Beginner Magics of Necromancy from his space ring, and then seeing that many parts of the book had been highlighted and noted by Han Shua, Fanny immediately looked askance at Han Shua. She exclaimed lightly, "You're already reading this book. Have you grasped all the magics that magic apprentices should know? And you've taken a lot of notes. Looks like you really didn't slack off during this month. I've thought wrongly of you. Of course I've already grasped the magics that magic apprentices should know." Han Shua smiled. He thought for a moment and released the Agony of the Soul magic in front of Fanny. Fanny immediately said, "Oh my goodness. Brian, you're too amazing. You actually have enough mental strength to release the Agony of the Soul magic." This means that your mental strength has truly reached the level of a novice mage. You're a genius, a true genius. Han Shuo wasn't sure if he was a genius or not, but he knew that his mental strength could only improve so rapidly due to that odd, green, round ball. He still hadn't figured out what this green, round ball was, but he was absolutely sure that it had something to do with the cemetery of death. After a string of surprised exclamations from Fanny, Han Shuo started seriously asking Fanny all his questions about magical knowledge that he didn't know. As an adept mage, Fanny's constant homework had always been to teach students how to understand magic and was very familiar with this foundational knowledge. She went out of her way to resolve all of Han Shuo's difficult questions. During the process, the two were quite close to each other and Han Shuo could smell the fragrance wafting off of Fanny's body. Their gazes would interlock during explanations and have a sense of mutual admiration due to shared enlightenment. Fanny didn't feel distaste at Han Shuo being so close to her, and would actually clap his shoulder as she complimented him whenever he clearly understood one of her explanations. Time passed unknowingly in Fanny's lab. The two of them had conversed for several hours, yet Fanny wasn't the slightest bit impatient. She seemed rather delighted and would never be bored because she had met a good student. It wasn't until when the bells started ringing that Fanny came to herself with a shock. When she recovered her senses, she said lightly, "Oh no, I almost forgot that I still needed to preside over class at the training fields later this afternoon. Brian, your comprehension abilities are very high. Looks like you've chosen the right path in learning necromancy magic, but let's stop here for today. I'm going to the training fields to teach my class. Do you want to come with me?" Shaking his head, Han Shuo smiled, "I'd rather not. I've already thoroughly grasped some of the lower-level magics. I've understood from you today many of the things that I didn't previously understand, and need some time to carefully think about them. I won't be going to the training fields." Nodding, Fanny didn't press further and hastily cleaned up the lab. She picked up a book, adjusted her collar, and said, "That works too. You can come meet with me in private in the next couple of days and I'll help you go over the areas that you don't understand." "Oh. Right. Lisa seems to have been very worried that you were gone for so long. She asked me where you went." "Heh, I haven't been up to much. Please tell her not to worry. I'll be going now, and will come disturb you quite often in the next few days." "Thank you in advance, Master Fanny." Han Shuo said carelessly and left before Fanny left her lab. He thought for a bit, avoided the crowded areas, and started walking outside the academy. After leaving the academy, Han Shuo circled past 2 roads very carefully, finally making his way towards Phoebe's residence. Han Shuo vaguely felt that he was in a bad place after the assassination at the Boost Merchant Guild. Not only had he offended Grover, but it was likely that even Phoebe held a grudge against him, but for the black gold ore, Han Shuo had to grit his teeth and come find Phoebe again. He only hoped that the past 10 or so days had been enough to calm her temper. The same old butler answered the door again, with Fabian coming by shortly after Han Shuo had walked in because he'd heard the news. He still wore a faint smile when he saw Han Shuo, saying, "Brian, how come you have time to swing by today?" Smiling wryly, Han Shuo shook his head and sighed, "Don't mention it. I helped your young miss assassinate Darnell and Yuna in the Boost Merchant Guild last time, but somehow offended your Miss Phoebe. Not only did I receive no compensation, but she actually beat me up. Terribly unlucky." "Oh. Although Miss Phoebe comes from a wealthy family, she isn't the type to throw a tantrum without cause. What happened between you and Miss Phoebe?" "After she came back in the dead of the night that day, she spent the next couple of days being angry. I happened to overhear her curse you as despicable, shameless, and disgusting. I truly don't understand what could have happened for her to be in such a terrible mood." Fabian looked at Han Shuo with confusion, saying slowly as he seemed deep in thought. His face wry, Han Shuo sighed lowly once again. "Forget it, let's not mention those things again. I have to find her again for my materials. Is Miss Phoebe home right now? Apologies, the miss is out and temporarily not available, but I think she'll return shortly, so if you're not in a hurry, you can wait here a bit. Alright, then I'll wait for her for a bit. Indeed, Han Shua's ear caught the sound of someone knocking at the door from far away after waiting for a short while. As his heart started to agitate with unease, he privately weighed up what he should say to Phoebe when he saw her later. Just as Han Shua's brow was deeply furrowed in thought, a man's voice sounded lightly. You're Brian, what are you doing here? Han Shua started and immediately lifted his head, realizing that the warrior Lawrence, who had spent 5 gold coins to hire him as a human target last time in the Warriors Academy, was standing at the door with Phoebe. Senior brother Lawrence, you know him. Outside the door, Phoebe looked at Lawrence, astonished, as she asked in surprise. Of course, he's Brian, the errand boy from our academy. Lawrence answered matter-of-factly. Errand boy. Phoebe and Fabian both exclaimed at the same time. Phoebe measured up Han Shua with an odd look as she asked Lawrence, Senior brother, your Babylon Academy of Magic and Force is the most renowned school throughout the Empire. Why would such a despicable, shameless, and disgusting person be present? Lawrence started upon hearing these words and shrugged his shoulders at Han Shua, smiling at Phoebe, little junior sister, how did Brian offend you? I rather admire his tenacious and unyielding personality. Han Shua's face was wry as he sat there without a word, drinking tea with a lowered head, one sip after another. He privately reflected that he was in quite the pickle. He hadn't thought that Lawrence would be Phoebe's senior brother. Now that his identity had been revealed, if Phoebe wanted to pursue previous events, it would be troublesome for even him to avoid this. Chapter 76. He's my boyfriend. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Senior brother Lawrence, come with me, I'll give you the items you need. Phoebe said to Lawrence, seemingly a bit bored after Han Shua made no response to the round of sarcasm directed towards him. Han Shua only drank mouthful after mouthful of water with a wry face. Before she left, Phoebe's clear eyes glared viciously at Han Shua as her body halted, if you're not in a hurry, wait for a while. Han Shua lifted his head to look at Phoebe, clearly perceiving her repressed anger. Remember that the materials for his Demon's Lair edge were still in her hands, he immediately nodded out of resignation. Phoebe led Lawrence off to the side. Fabian looked at Han Shua with an extremely odd look after they left, asking with surprise, Brian, to think that you're only an errand boy at the Babylon Academy of School of Magic. My gosh, but you're so strong, what's going on? Nothing much. Oh right, this Lawrence is part of the Warrior Academy at our academy, a very ordinary sergeant knight, but Miss Phoebe has the strength of a swordmaster. How could the two of them have the same master? Han Shua was quite perplexed as he asked Fabian. Although knights and swordsmen could train the same fighting aura, Lawrence was merely a sergeant knight, whereas Phoebe had the strength of a swordmaster while training underneath the same master. The gap between the two was simply too great, particularly when Han Shua had clearly heard from their mouths that Lawrence was the senior disciple brother and Phoebe was just the junior sister. This made Han Shua feel that it was even odder. I'm not too clear about the young miss situation either. I was just an insignificant character in the Boost Merchant Guild before. I'd only heard that the young miss was studying abroad before the guildmaster passed away, and would only return once or twice each year. If it wasn't for the fact that the guildmaster suddenly passed away, Miss Phoebe likely wouldn't have suddenly stayed. Lawrence only appeared recently. Their relationship is indeed quite close, but I have no way of answering your questions either. Fabian looked apologetically at Han Shua as he explained. Han Shua didn't ask further after this explanation, but merely nodded and frowned in contemplation. After a while, Phoebe and Lawrence once again stood at the door. Phoebe looked at Fabian and instructed, Fabian, show senior brother Lawrence out the door for me. I have a few words to speak to Mr. Brian in private. Yes, miss. Fabian stood up, knowing how to behave in a delicate situation, and walked outside. Brian, I'm very happy to see you here. If you'd like to earn a few more gold coins in the future, you can come find me at any time. However, I think you won't be needing that anymore. Alright, see you later Brian, I think we'll have plenty of opportunities to meet in the future. Lawrence looked meaningfully at Han Shoa, laughed lightly and followed Fabian out. When the two had left, Phoebe walked in with a cold face and flicked a glance at Han Shoa after sitting down, snorting lightly, "How dare you come back here again? And why wouldn't I dare?" Han Shoa's eyebrow flicked, not taking anything lying down as he stared back into Phoebe's eyes. "I haven't done anything against my conscience, not to mention you still owe me from last time. As long as you give me the materials you promised and the black gold ore, I'll leave immediately and won't come do business with you ever again." Phoebe slammed her hand down on the table and glared at Han Shoa furiously. How dare you demand things from me? Damn it, you violated me and I've been nice enough not to kill you. Bullshit, both you and I were influenced by the aphrodisiac then. I was the one who dragged you out of the guild, otherwise you'd be long dead by now. Not to mention I didn't really do anything to you, otherwise I wouldn't have brought you to the river. Han Shoa was truly angry now. He had toiled all night long and not only had he gained nothing, but he'd suffered a beating at her hands. This Phoebe wouldn't let go of this matter. Was she truly trying to avoid paying up? Phoebe drew out her long sword with a clang and glared wrathfully at Han Shoa. Han Shoa also abruptly slammed the table and immediately stood up, glaring ferociously at Phoebe, seeming to want to break into a fight as soon as the two disagreed. The two of them glared at each other and maintained this position for nearly a minute. Phoebe curled her lip and stuck her long sword back into the sheath with another clang. She turned her head, no longer looking at Han Shoa, and said coldly, "Just what do you want?" "Very simple. I'll purchase the other materials according to the estimate you gave me and give me the black gold ore that you owe me. Our debts will be resolved this way and we won't have anything to do with each other in the future. I won't conduct any more stupid transactions with you anymore." Han Shoa sat down with a darkened face and drained the water from the glass in front of him with one gulp, saying decisively, "You drat, profit-seeking jerk. Here, take it all and get out of here." Phoebe felt an involuntary surge of rage upon hearing Han Shoa's words as uncontrollable anger showed in her expression. She withdrew a large bundle of items rather irritably from her space ring and slammed it down on the table, throwing it in front of Han Shoa, leveling a harsh glare at Han Shoa. You prepared it all, why didn't you say so? We were harming our amiability for nothing." Han Shoa had planned on taking the items and leaving, but saw that the bundle of items were packaged orderly. There was a piece of odd-looking ore, contained in a clear flask, with the words, "Black Gold," written on it. It looked like Phoebe had been long since prepared for his arrival and hadn't planned on going back on her word. But what Han Shoa couldn't wrap his mind around was that since Phoebe hadn't planned on going back on her word, why did she come in with such an explosive temper and say that she hadn't planned on giving him anything? This was rather baffling, and Han Shoa couldn't make any sense of it. "Give me your crystal card, I'll transfer the appropriate amount of gold coins into your card." I actually didn't have any other meaning and just wanted to take back what was owed to me." Han Shoa smiled rather awkwardly, but still put this bundle of items into his space ring, then talked to Phoebe, somewhat abashed. Still not properly looking at Han Shoa, Phoebe had a face of cold arrogance and said stiffly, "No need. I'm not as miserly as you. It's only 3,500 gold. Treat it as a gift. Don't let me see you in the future, just get out." Seeing that she was so sarcastic and jeering, Han Shoa's face froze and he nodded, slapping down the piece of black iron ore that he had mined the day before. He too said coldly, "I don't like owing favors to strangers. Treat this ore as compensation of me purchasing your other ores. Goodbye Miss Phoebe, I won't be doing business with you in the future." Just as Han Shoa was about to resolutely leave the room, Phoebe suddenly lost her composure and stood up, looking at Han Shoa with a lost expression. Her wise eyes were full of weakness and weariness. She spoke with a desolate voice, "You're going to treat me as a stranger from now on." Shrugging, Han Shoa said naturally and unconstrained, "Since you don't care to treat me as a friend, I, of course, will not shamelessly impose on you." Han Shoa smiled naturally after these words and began to walk outside, but Phoebe suddenly called out lightly before he walked out the door, "Wait." Turning his head to look at Phoebe, Han Shoa asked calmly, "Miss Phoebe, what other matters are there?" Phoebe's expression was a bit odd. She lowered her head and thought silently for a bit, but when she lifted her head, a good half of the weakness and weariness had actually vanished. Her direct stare at Han Shoa made him feel very odd. She even quirked her lips at the end and revealed a trace of a smile, asking, "Brian, you mean that you already viewed me as a friend?" Astounded, Han Shoa nodded and replied factly, "Of course, we've gone through 2 life or death experiences in the Buzzed Merchant Guild, not to mention you've helped me on several occasions. I already consider you a friend, but you're not willing." "Who says I'm not willing, huh? Apart from monetary transactions, are you so heartless to all your friends?" Phoebe's expressions had returned to normal by now and had a few more traces of human interest compared to her normal, remote aloofness, and she used the same attitude she had used towards Lawrence just now when talking to Han Shoa. "Of course not," Han Shoa responded. Han Shoa could clearly feel that Phoebe's words had been permeated with sincerity and worry. He felt a bit touched inside, and his facial expressions became more tender. After thinking carefully, Han Shoa felt that Phoebe's words should be fine. He frowned and said to Phoebe, "Then, what do you think I should do?" "Eliminate Grover with me, otherwise we will never have days of peace." Phoebe's charming face grew cold as she bit off her words. Musing for a bit, Han Shoa suddenly felt that perhaps a life ensconced in danger was more suitable for him to break through. His life had been too simple and monotone before, perhaps additional stimulus would make it more interesting. Add to that what Phoebe had said, if the threat of Grover wasn't eliminated, he may truly be faced with endless troubles. After musing for a bit, Han Shoa said resolutely, "All right, I promise you. Then, accompany me to the personal banquet held by the guild tonight. Several of the founding elders will be present at this banquet." Phoebe's charming face was gladdened upon seeing Han Shoa agree, and she immediately opened her mouth in inquiry. A banquet held by your guild? What am I going to do there?" Han Shoa started and asked. "Gain the goodwill of the other founding elders and take precautions against the schemes of that old thing. Brian, I need your help, you just said that we're friends, right?" Phoebe looked straight at Han Shoa and asked. He suddenly had the feeling that he'd boarded a pirate ship and was about to be taken advantage of. Han Shoa felt a bit odd. But he had indeed admitted that the two were friends earlier according to Phoebe's intentions. He was unable to back down now, and could only grit his teeth and agree. Exclaiming softly, Phoebe said happily, "Wonderful, wait a moment and I'll have someone tailor a tuxedo that fits you. I also need to teach you some basic noble courtesies. I've already learned from Lawrence that you're from the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. I think you're probably not too well versed in such things." Throwing an ill-tempered look at her, Han Shoa said, "I was an errand boy, but that was in the past. There's nothing untowards about it and nothing that can't be talked about. Sorry Brian, I really didn't mean anything by it, truly." Phoebe was a bit agitated and hastened to apologize with genuinity. "No worries, tell me, I'll listen carefully." Han Shoa waved his hand with indifference and indicated for Phoebe to begin. This is black iron ore." It was as if she'd just discovered it as Phoebe looked at the black iron ore that Han Shoa had set on the table. She looked at Han Shoa with astonishment. "You actually have black iron ore, it looks like you truly want to forge the best weapon." "Absolutely." Han Shoa responded firmly. Phoebe gave Han Shoa an overview of the basic courtesies of nobility. Han Shoa understood that in order to climb to a higher level in this world, he must indeed have a grasp of such mannerisms. Therefore, he docilely listened to Phoebe's descriptions and even tried to make a few of the basic gestures of courtesies according to Phoebe's demands. When night fell, Han Shoa had already changed into the tuxedo that Phoebe had specially prepared for him and actually cleaned up nicely. He followed behind Phoebe and rode in a carriage to arrive at the Buzzed Merchant Guild for the third time. Many luxurious and opulent carriages were parked in front of the doors and the guards had been changed out. They were two unfamiliar faces to Han Shoa. When Phoebe and Han Shoa both alighted from the carriage, they walked in with the ease of experience without having to greet the guards. Phoebe led the way past two hallways and appeared at the entrance of the banquet hall. "Niece Phoebe, this is a private banquet of our guild, it doesn't seem too appropriate that you've brought him." Grover's hand held a wine glass filled with fine wine at the front of the door and happened to be conversing delightfully with a couple obviously well-off guild elders. When he saw Phoebe and Han Shoa walk in, he first looked balefully at Han Shoa and then addressed Phoebe. "Uncle Grover, Mr. Bryan isn't an outsider." Phoebe thinned her lips and laughed lightly, glancing at Han Shoa with some shyness as she explained. "Oh. Then dear niece, can you tell me why he isn't an outsider?" Grover's eyes squinted as he sized up Han Shoa with venomous, snake-like eyes, speaking sinisterly as he did so. "He's my boyfriend." Phoebe threw her head back, looking at Grover directly in the eyes without fear as she said proudly. Chapter 77. The Position of Guildmaster. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Welcome reader. You found the real chapter for GDK. Happy April Fools. Chapter 77. The Position of Guildmaster, boyfriend. Grover was startled and had an exceedingly odd expression as he looked at Phoebe. His gaze at Han Shoa afterwards was even more odd, and confirmed again as if he didn't believe what he had just heard. "Is he really your boyfriend?" "Of course." Phoebe nodded affirmatively, and stretched out her arm with a red face and held Han Shoa's left hand, like she wanted to prove the relationship between the two. Han Shoa's mouth was open as if someone had shoved an egg into his mouth, an expression of dumbfoundedness appearing on his face. He didn't react until he felt Phoebe secretly apply pressure to his arm with her small hand, laughing dryly and nodded without explaining anything. One of the guild elders talking jovially with Grover said doubtfully to Grover in a low voice, "What's this kid's background?" Grover didn't say much, only throwing a look at this person and turned his body to the side. He smiled, "Since he's your boyfriend Phoebe, then there's no problem. Hurry and come on in." Dragging Han Shoa, Phoebe's facial expression was as usual as she walked into the hall. She greeted a few founding members with a smile and continued to drag Han Shoa to a place with fewer people. Waiters held platters filled with fruit and fine wine throughout the hall, placing them on square tables located in a spacious area. A large chandelier overhead sent bright light into every cranny of the room. The decorations, that littered the entire hall, were incredibly luxurious, giving a rustic countryman, such as Han Shoa, quite a shock. But, what shocked Han Shoa the most was Phoebe's words just now. When he saw that there was no one around, he immediately smiled wryly at Phoebe. "Miss Phoebe, what did you mean to do by doing all of this?" Conveniently snatching a wine glass, Phoebe poured a glass of delicious red wine for herself, gracefully raising it to her lips for a light taste, finally speaking afterwards, "Don't think too much, I'm just finding a cover for your presence and don't mean anything else by it. If I didn't say such things, you probably wouldn't even be able to make it inside." Nodding, Han Shoa sighed resignedly and said, "I knew that nothing good would result from me following you here. You have to act more natural, I'll cover things for you. This is the annual gathering of the guild and all the founding elders will attend. As bold as Grover is, he wouldn't dare to make a move at this time, so we don't have to worry." Phoebe spoke softly to Han Shoa as her eyes continuously scanned his surroundings. BDNV also grabbing a wine glass to pour himself half a glass, Han Shoa took a sip and found it tartly delicious. He observed his surroundings once more with keen interest, finding that many of the guild members had also brought their other halves. There were 20 or 30 people in the entire hall. There were some elderly members and some handsome youths. There were also some beautiful married women with the graceful bearing and demure of noble ladies. Without an exception, all of these people were dressed richly and their motions urbanely polite. It looked like this was the so-called style of the upper class. Grover held a wine glass in hand and threaded through all the people, amiably greeting everyone and looking quite friendly. The Buzzed Merchant Guild has always been controlled by the Buzzed family. My family had always been the guild master before, but because I was always traveling outside, that old thing temporarily took the position of guild master after my father passed away, but don't think that he has good relations with many of the elders. No one really knows what goes on in the dark, otherwise there'd be no point in me coming back. As Han Shoa silently observed the surroundings, Phoebe gave her explanations in a low voice. When Phoebe was finished, a thought struck Han Shoa as he suddenly asked, "How did your father die? Did you know nothing beforehand?" When he said this, a trace of killing intent instantly blossomed in Phoebe's eyes. She suppressed her voice and said with a cold expression, "I'm still investigating how my father died. I haven't found any evidence yet because I'm usually not in the guild and thus am not too certain of many things. The founding elders probably don't really trust my abilities and thus their attitudes are all vague and indefinite. My current task at hand is to win over the support of the founding elders, otherwise I'll be unable to shake that old thing from his position with my power alone." Han Shoa understood that Phoebe was also suspecting the reasons behind her father's death with these words. He didn't say much more and held his wine glass, observing those in the hall and privately considering a few things. A few more people entered after a while. An elder with grizzled sideburns walked in last into the hall with the support of a butler. When this person appeared, many people in the hall made their way over to make their greetings. Phoebe immediately pulled Han Shoa in this direction as well when she saw him, quickly explaining in a low voice, "He's Andrew. He founded the Buzzed Merchant Guild along with my grandfather and is currently the founding elder with the longest record of service within the guild. Even Grover doesn't dare to act too wildly in front of him. We won't be as passive if he helps us." Arriving in front of Andrew, Phoebe made a restrained bow and said with a smile of joy on her face, "Grandpa Andrew, you've come as well. It's our beautiful little Phoebe. Grandpa hasn't seen you in quite a while, you've grown so tall." Andrew's left hand grasped his cane, while his right hand was being supported by a butler as he chuckled at Phoebe. "Good niece, don't just stand around talking, hurry and let the elderly sit down. When one is at that age, it must be very tiring to take a carriage the whole way here. He mustn't be kept standing," Grover said to Phoebe as he walked over in Andrew's direction, seeming to want to lead Andrew in a seat on his side. No worries. I'm having a delightful conversation with little Phoebe. I haven't seen our little Phoebe in quite a while." Andrew evaded Grover's support and actually raised his cane to walk in Han Shoa and Phoebe's direction. Grover's brows involuntarily knit into a frown as he saw Phoebe lead Andrew to the other side with a look of surprise on her face. His gaze patrolled over Andrew's body, seeming to be contemplating something. When Phoebe, Andrew, and Han Shoa had all sat down in a corner on the other end of the hall, Phoebe and Andrew hadn't even had a chance to speak before Grover had raised a glass and said with a chuckle, "Founding elders of the Buzzed Merchant Guild, today is the annual gathering of our guild. It's a pleasure to see everyone again this year. It's a pity that because of health reasons, my dear brother has passed away from an illness. This is quite a tragic event. Don't worry, Grover, everything is orderly under your management. I think if the guildmaster knew, he would be touched and gratified." One of the founding elders suddenly spoke up at this time with two others by his side chiming in. Han Shoa watched their performance with a cold eye, having a clear understanding of things in his heart. He knew that these people were sure to have close relations with Grover, and were merely declaring their stance with these words. At this moment, Han Shoa, seated next to Phoebe, could clearly hear Andrew snort in a very low tone. Phoebe was even closer to Andrew and naturally heard things clearly. She glanced involuntarily with surprise at Andrew, and exchanged a look with Han Shoa. The guildmaster has already passed away, but our Buzzed Merchant Guild cannot be without a guildmaster forever. I think we should take advantage of this opportunity to thoroughly discuss the particulars of a new guildmaster. What does everyone think? The same person called out in a carrying voice, and the two founding elders, who had chimed in before, once again assented. Grover's face was calm, only sitting there and continuously looking around the four corners of the room, with his gaze pausing a bit longer on Phoebe and Andrew. Of course, the position of guildmaster cannot be empty for too long, but who will be the guildmaster? This is an important question. A stocky founding elder said in a seat not too far away with a low, muffled voice. What else is there to discuss? Grover should be the new guildmaster, of course. Since the guildmaster's passing, Grover has been the one to manage the guild's affairs. Everyone has also seen that the guild has been stable and orderly in his hands. I don't think anyone else is qualified to sit in this seat other than Grover. The Grover supporter abruptly stood up and called out, winning the other two people's assent. Grover stood up with a smile, his face full of hypocritical humility as he spoke words that his abilities were limited or that he was embarrassed by undeserved praise. The three were resolute in that it must be him, and the merry band demonstrated quite outstanding partnership. Uncle Andrew, who do you think is more suitable to be the new guildmaster? At this moment, the founding elder, who had previously spoken in a low, muffled voice, looked at Andrew from afar and asked. All the looks from the surrounding founding elders focused on Andrew, as if waiting for him to express his decision. Andrew looked in Phoebe's direction, the latter pretending to be calm and composed. He slightly stood up and chuckled lightly, "It's not me at any case, I don't have that many days left to live, heh heh." Everyone displayed friendly smiles after his words. Grover also smiled and laughed softly, like he was heaving a sigh of relief because he was truly afraid that Andrew would step forward and seize the position of guildmaster from him. However, Andrew's gaze swept over the assembled and he continued, "I think that little Phoebe has grown up. Since she is the daughter of the guildmaster and a member of the Buzzed family clan, logically speaking, she is the most qualified person to be the new guildmaster. Why has no one mentioned this? No, absolutely not. Miss Phoebe is too young and has always been traveling outside. She doesn't even know of all the matters within the guild. If she were to become the guildmaster, she may ruin the business of the guild." The founding elder, who'd been upholding Grover, immediately protested violently. "Kiro, that may not be the case. Although Miss Phoebe is young, I see that she's quite knowledgeable and mature. She also knows the proper limits for speech and action when doing something. Perhaps with her at the helm, she'll even be able to bring further development to the guild." A founding elder suddenly opened his mouth. All the other elders who had been staying silent without a word suddenly chimed in upon seeing Andrew express his support for Phoebe. 3 or 4 other elders still remained quiet, as if expressing their neutrality. How will this do? We can't take the future of the guild as an experiment for her competency." The loyal Grover supporter called Kiro immediately complained. "How can we not? If I recall correctly, when the old guildmaster first took over the guild, he was only 23 himself, but under the guidance of Andrew and a few others, the old guildmaster quickly grew up and helped the guild become more prosperous with every passing day. I believe that Miss Phoebe will also be able to do so. Not to mention with us aiding her, no major problems will develop as well." The person continued to say. Grover's face had darkened and he'd stopped speaking after Andrew had spoken out. Finally standing up at this time, he said to Phoebe, "Good niece, your boyfriend was once an errand boy for the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, and had the status of a slave. Don't think that I'm poking my nose in too many places, but if people found out that the two of you were together, it would affect the reputation of our guild. Several of the founding elders shifted their focus towards Han Shoa after these words, unable to conceal the contempt and disdain on their faces. Han Shoa gave a horrified startled look, finally understanding that Phoebe's worries weren't without reason. It looked like he had underestimated the power of Grover and Shadow Ghost. Who would have thought that they'd be able to investigate his background with only his first name? It was a good thing that he had spent most of his time in the cemetery of death lately. Otherwise, if he'd stayed at the school, he may have long since been assassinated by highly trained killers. Uncle, what do you mean by this? At this moment, Phoebe suddenly stood up, her charming face cold as she stared at Grover angrily, wanting to throw all decorum to the side. Don't get angry, dear niece. I just wanted to say that your judgment doesn't seem too good. In order to manage the guild, a daring, wise, and far-sighted judgment is most important. If you choose even your future husband from the slaves, then I don't think I'm content to let you be guildmaster. A peaceful smile was still on Grover's face, but the words he said were quite vicious. I think a person who can murder his own brother for profit and continuously send out killers to attempt to harm his own niece is even less worth of the position of guildmaster. Han Shoa also stood up and watched Grover with a cold smile, completely fearless and seemingly unaware of how shocking his words were. Pausing in the astonished gaze of the entire hall, Han Shoa said again, "Please remember that I am a student of the academy now. I no longer have the status of a slave and never will again." Chapter 78. A blood battle in the deep alleyways. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Shut your mouth. Don't make unfounded accusations. I had such a deep relationship with my elder brother, how could I possibly kill him? Dear niece, I feel so bad for you since you found a boyfriend that doesn't understand the principles of propriety. Grover's face changed drastically as he surged to his feet, slamming his hands down on the tabletop and roared angrily. His expression as usual, Han Shoa lightly laughed and glossed over the matter. Everyone already knows this. Phoebe is the guildmaster's only daughter and should be the candidate most qualified to inherit the position of guildmaster. If she were to be assassinated, who stands to profit? When was it an outsider's turn to talk about the matters of the Buzzed Merchant Guild? Phoebe, you should keep this outsider, who doesn't know what he's talking about, in line. Grover glared viciously at Han Shoa as he turned to talk to Phoebe. At this moment, Phoebe had already calmed down from her earlier panic. She'd always maintained a veneer of civility with Grover, but how was she to know that Han Shoa would have no qualms whatsoever and stand in sharp opposition from the beginning, almost having a throwdown with Grover instantaneously, throwing all her plans into disarray. She didn't know what to do for the span of a moment. However, just as Han Shoa and Grover were denouncing each other, Phoebe's thoughts churned and she felt that Han Shoa's actions were clear and decisive. Because of his actions, her attitude would clearly be displayed in front of the founding elders. This would also show the founding elders that she wasn't some weak person who wasn't willing to fight for her position. Except, it was the time to measure her gains and losses. Since Han Shoa had already so sharply announced his stance, there wasn't a way that Phoebe could salvage the situation even if she wanted to. Immediately after Grover's words had been cut off, she said confidently, "Indeed, Uncle Grover, I believe that I have the qualifications to be a competent guildmaster. Although in recent years I have spent my days outside, Father has never given up his tutelage of me. The knowledge I have learned is also relevant to operating the guild. Father has long since arranged all this. I hope you can support me, Uncle, and teach me if I am found lacking in any places. I am confident that I can take good care of the guild. Good niece, your courage is worth complimenting. However, a matter such as this is not child's play. One misstep is enough to doom the guild beyond redemption. Uncle is cowardly and cannot afford to shoulder such responsibility." Since they were laying everything out, Grover no longer hid and concealed his intentions as he spoke with a darkened face. At this moment, Andrew suddenly grasped his cane and tottered to his feet. He spoke in a conciliatory tone, there's no point in arguing further. How about this? Why don't we let little Phoebe try first? If the guild is still expanding smoothly in her hands after 3 months, then let Phoebe be the guild master. If not, Grover will continue to be. What does everyone think? Since Andrew had spoken, apart from the 3 founding elders who supported Grover, all the other founding elders expressed their consent. Andrew waited until they all had expressed their opinions before smiling at Grover, saying merrily, "Since the majority has agreed, let's do this for no. What do you think?" As unwilling as he was, since the majority of the founding elders within the guild had agreed, Grover had no way of changing the situation. He could only grit his teeth and say with resignation, "Since this is the case, then let's move according to your wishes." Nodding, Andrew smiled, "Then good. I have a few matters to attend to, so I will be taking my leave." "Ah, little Phoebe, I haven't seen you in so long. If you have nothing else to do, come to my house for a chat." "Sure, I happen to want to ask Grandpa about your experiences in managing the guild." Phoebe smiled faintly and stood up. She put down the wine glass, threw a look at Han Shoa, and walked out without even looking at Grover. Han Shoa put down his wineglass and flashed a contemptuous, cold smile at Grover, who was staring at him frostily. He followed behind Phoebe and headed outside the hall. After leaving the guild, Phoebe looked around and saw that it was empty. She said softly to Han Shoa, "Go back to my residence first. I'll rush back after chatting with Grandpa Andrew. We'll talk later." "Heh, little Phoebe, your boyfriend is quite bold. He dared to argue with Grover in the hall. I think you have quite the eye." Andrew stood on the side of his carriage as he looked benevolently upon Phoebe and Han Shoa. Her charming face blushing red, Phoebe looked at Han Shoa and whispered, "Be careful." She then walked to Andrew and said cutely, "No way. You don't know how frustrating it is because he's so pudding-headed sometimes." Han Shoa didn't listen further to their conversation any longer and didn't take the carriage that he had arrived in with Phoebe, but rather set out for the northern part of the city alone. Since it was late at night anyways, there were almost no pedestrians on the road. When Han Shoa had just left the Boost Merchant Guild, he didn't feel that he was in too much danger, but when he threaded past a street and just walked into an alleyway, he suddenly became alert. His thoughts moved as 3 original demons were soundlessly released from the back of his neck. When the original demons left Han Shoa's neck, they immediately assumed the form of nothingness and lay in wait, in 3 different directions, without leaving a trace behind in the darkness. As if he'd gained additional pairs of eyes, Han Shoa could clearly see not only the direction in front of him, but even the area behind and to the left and right of him. Refined by magical yuan, there wasn't the slightest bit of fighting aura or magic pulse from the original demons. Under the status of nothingness, it was quite difficult for the human eye to detect any trace of them. Thus, the departure and concealment of the original demons didn't startle anyone. The Wind Adept Mage Ellis, whom Han Shoa had seen last time, was floating like a wispy ghost behind Han Shoa. He hung soundlessly waiting. 4 killers, clad in black clothes and head coverings, were also on the roofs of the houses on either side of the alleyway. They walked on soundlessly, quietly following behind him and slowly closing in on him. Startled, Han Shoa hadn't thought that Grover would be so daring. He had just left the guild when the latter made his move. It looked like Grover's hatred for him was bone deep. Han Shoa suddenly calmed down when it came to the moment of his survival. There were 5 in total. Apart from the Wind Adept Mage Ellis, the other 4 weren't that weak either. According to the observations of the original demons, Han Shoa discovered that the 4 of them were divided into 2 warriors, 1 mage, and 1 archer. If it wasn't for the fact that the original demons could monitor their movements at any time, Han Shoa would be hard-pressed to escape his death. However, with the addition of the original demons, although Han Shoa still didn't have any advantages, he wasn't without the hope of escaping. From Phoebe's descriptions, Han Shoa knew that there was a mansion up ahead that was the residence of the Empire soldiers stationed here. Han Shoa had chosen to walk through this gloomy alleyway precisely because of the manner that lay before him. His thoughts churning madly, Han Shoa understood that these people could only make their move within the alleyway. Otherwise, once he made it through, they would lose their chance. The space ring lit up faintly as Han Shoa clasped the dagger in his right hand. His footsteps moved forward at a measured pace, neither too slow nor too fast, as he continuously paid attention to the movements of the enemy through the observations of the original demons. Finally, when Han Shoa made it to the center of the alleyway, the 5 killers, including Ellis, seemed to believe that this was a good chance as their approach speed suddenly picked up. An exceedingly light sound of an arrow whistling through the air suddenly fell into Han Shoa's hearing range. The arrow was uncommonly sharp as it made straight for Han Shoa, its momentum exceedingly fierce. This arrow had come from a professional archer. The angle and tip were exceedingly brutal. If it hadn't been for the fact that Han Shoa had clearly observed his actions through the original's demons, then it was very likely that he would have fallen to the arrow on the spot. His originally measured paces suddenly picked up, but he didn't rush forward, but rather dodged to the left. The arrow shot past the corners of Han Shoa's clothes with a whooshing sound, whistling violently towards the front. The arrow suddenly fractured into pieces in front of Han Shoa, as Ellis had long since released a few sharp wind blades. He seemed to be waiting for Han Shoa to subconsciously move further in, but Han Shoa had already detected this and evaded them. At the same time, the air above his head suddenly lit up as a patch of fire wall abruptly formed and came down over his head. 2 nimble figures, wielding longswords, came flying down from the roofs. Han Shoa could clearly see the pale green and dark green fighting auras thanks to the light provided by the fire walls. Abruptly increasing his speed, Han Shoa's speed suddenly raised instantaneously and circled to the left, avoiding the obstruction of Ellis' wind blades and dashing out of the entrance of the alleyway. Han Shoa had just left his position when the fire wall slammed down, and sparks flew up from the place he had just been standing. No matter how they imagined things, they would never know that Han Shoa had already clearly seen their intentionally concealed tracks through the eyes of the original demons. They had thought it was absolutely an unexpected attack, but it had already been completely observed by Han Shoa. This is what caused the extraordinarily talented group of 5 to fail their first wave of attacks completely. Don't let him leave the alleyway alive. Ellis' soft voice was purposefully sharp and hard as it sounded at this moment. The archer and fire mage stood on either side on the rooftops of the alleyway. When Ellis' words were spoken, they made their move at almost the same time. The archer grabbed 3 arrows and notched them to his bow, shooting them all at the same time with a whistling sound. They flew fiercely towards Han Shoa's forehead, back, and thigh. Another wall of flames suddenly formed in the direction that Han Shoa was dashing in, blocking off his escape and forcing him to take the long way around. Otherwise he would be hard-pressed to escape the funeral pyre of the flaming walls. The 2 swordsmen who had just landed took advantage of the situation to quickly approach with their longswords. They were only 10 or so meters away from Han Shoa. Ellis' feet hovered above the ground as he quickly closed the distance from behind, obviously planning on keeping Han Shoa here. Tilting his body, Han Shoa once again changed directions and made for the right. He planned on circling past the fire walls and rush out onto the street. Several wind blades came whistling in, but it was all within Han Shoa's expectations. The dagger in his hand moved swiftly as he cut away at 5 wind blades. However, 3 of them still drew across his thigh and arms. Him suffering 3 hits was under the circumstances of Han Shoa knowing that Ellis had sent wind blades there earlier, otherwise if 10 wind blades connected with his vitals, it would be likely that he would be unable to take another step forward. Han Shoa bore up beneath the injuries to his thigh and arms and rushed out from the windblade ambush, simultaneously evading the fire wall and flying arrows, dashing to the alley's entrance like lightning. He was about to rush out onto the street. At this moment, an exceedingly ghastly wail cut through the quiet night sky. In the midst of running, Han Shuo used the original demons to discover that the archer's bow had been cleaved into two, and was falling listlessly from the rooftop with blood at the corners of his mouth. Phoebe stood where he had just been standing, a long sword in hand and standing with a proud, majestic-looking air. Foe! Phoebe, you're a swordswoman. Beneath the head covering, Ellis was so surprised that he forgot to modulate his tone and used his original voice to exclaim in surprise. He didn't talk to the others as his quickly dashing body suddenly halted. He abruptly turned back and escaped towards the back with an even higher speed. Phoebe snorted coldly and didn't bother chasing the escaping Ellis. After all, if a wind mage were to attempt a full-out escape, it would be difficult indeed to catch up to him. The long sword in her hand waving, the majestic-looking Phoebe alighted gently from the roof towards the two warriors. It looked like she was planning on taking care of those who were still around. Han Shuo was about to rush out of the alleyway at this time and was overjoyed when he saw Phoebe suddenly appear. He swiftly did an about-face and opened his mouth to summon the little skeleton, running quickly towards the two warriors himself. The little skeleton wouldn't have been that useful when Han Shuo was fleeing for his life previously. With the presence of Phoebe the swordmaster now, Han Shuo had turned from the hunted to hunter. The little skeleton could naturally make an apprentice to kill enemies. When the bone dagger-wielding little skeleton appeared, it started running quickly under Han Shuo's commands. The 7 bone spurs on its back waved as it shot towards the roof, attempting to finish off the fire mage. The fire mage was shocked as he had never thought the little skeleton would be able to make use of its momentum to directly vault onto the roof. In his panic, he immediately muttered an incantation as the wildly blazing fire wall made an appearance again, blocking the path that the little skeleton would take. However, the little skeleton paid no attention to the obstruction of the fire wall and flung himself into it. It walked out with its body reddened from the fire wall and arrived in front of the fire mage's dumbfounded expression. The bone dagger in its hand danced as it turned the mage into a beehive. Chapter 79. Breaking through the boundary. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. There were only 2 swordsmen left, one senior and one journeyman swordsman. Phoebe herself was enough to make the 2 of them unable to escape death. Han Shuo turning back merely accelerated their deaths. With a flash of his space ring, Han Shuo held a crossbow in his hand and fitted a crossbow bolt into the string. He'd already targeted one of them, and shot at the back of the senior swordsman when they abruptly started retreating and wanted to take themselves out of the fight. The senior swordsman, who planned on leaving, had to turn back in resignation and block the bolt, but in the instant he destroyed the bolt, Phoebe was already standing in front of him. The little skeleton that had stabbed the fire mage to death held a bag in his left hand, jumping down from the roof with a whoosh. After his skeleton wobbled a bit, he was already standing with dagger in hand in front of the other journeyman swordsman. As Han Shuo strode over with a cold smile, one of the swordsmen suddenly drew his long sword across his neck and fell down. Be calm, these are people from Shadow Ghost. If they know that there's no way out for them, they'll choose to end their own lives. Phoebe shook her head, storing the long sword in her hand back into a space ring and said with a frown. The little skeleton had arrived in front of the 2 corpses at this moment and began to search them with practiced motions. When 2 more bags hung on its left hand, it walked over happily to Han Shuo with bone dagger in hand, offering the 3 bags to Han Shuo. Caressing the little skeleton's skull with a faint smile, Han Shuo took the 3 bags and cursed after one glance. Damn it, 3 poor sods. They only had 10 or so gold coins. Rolling her eyes at him with ill temper, Phoebe didn't search the corpses and directly said to Han Shuo. I've never seen someone as greedy as you. Don't bother searching their bodies, you won't discover anything. The people of Shadow Ghost never bring anything important with them when they go out on missions, so forget it, they won't bring any riches to you. Han Shuo cursed again when he heard Phoebe's words and chanted an incantation to send the little skeleton back. He then grinned and asked softly, didn't you leave with Andrew? Why did you suddenly return? You're hurt. Phoebe was shocked and immediately rushed to Han Shuo. When she saw the blood wounds left by the wind blades on Han Shuo's body, she immediately revealed a worried expression. The space ring on her finger lit up and some gauze and medicine appeared in her hands. She didn't shy away as she said softly, "Don't move." It was rare that Han Shuo saw Phoebe display such an expression, and he felt vaguely touched inside. He stood there dumbly, not moving at all, and looked at Phoebe carefully apply medicine to his injury, then using gauze to wrap it all up for him. When Phoebe was finished, she tugged at Han Shuo and exhaled lightly. "You sure know how to pick a place. Two manors are on the two sides of this alleyway and both families are out. No one's come out even after such a violent fight. It looks like the house hasn't been sold yet. However, we can't stay here for long. Although the security isn't too tight here, the guards will still patrol the area after a while. It'd be better if we leave earlier. Let's go." Han Shuo agreed and left with Phoebe, rushing to the northern part of the city. He asked along the way, "Oh right, you still haven't told me, why did you suddenly come back?" Seeing that there was no one around, Phoebe frowned and said in a low voice, "Grandpa Andrew told me in the carriage that Grover has been conducting transactions with the barbaric orcs, and has actually been selling the Empire's weapons to them. The implications of this matter are huge, and if the Empire knew, they wouldn't let him off easily. Grover must know that if I'm in charge of the guild, he won't be able to cover this up anyone. So he must kill me before I take control of the guild. Otherwise, once this matter is uncovered, as strong as he is, Grover will be hard-pressed to escape from the punishment of the Empire. Once I knew of this matter, I knew that he would try to kill you first. I worried about you, so I left Grandpa Andrew halfway through to come find you." Nodding, Han Shuo said, "So that's why. No wonder Grover wanted to kill us so quickly. It looks like as soon as you have evidence in hand, Grover will be done for without a doubt." "Exactly." Phoebe laughed coldly, but then sighed as she thought. "However, Ellis has learned of my strength this time. I think Grover will think of a plan, and even I will find it difficult to deal with his next assassination attempt." Han Shuo knew that his power was limited. If even Phoebe couldn't handle things, then he wouldn't have much effect either. The only thing he could do to help Phoebe was with his perceptive senses towards assassins. He thought for a moment and said, "I'll leave for a bit. I'll come find you when my injuries are healed. Grover is our mutual enemy now, I know what to do." "Alright, but don't go back to the academy no matter what you do. Since Grover knows your identity, you'll face tremendous danger if you stay in the academy the next couple of days." Phoebe mused and said to Han Shuo. Nodding his head in understanding, Han Shuo told Phoebe to be careful and left alone. The three original demons accompanied him, but didn't discover any other disturbances until Han Shuo came to the cemeteries behind the academy. After returning to the Cemetery of Death, Han Shuo trained his magic for a bit. A cool feeling wreathed around his injuries as he circulated his magical yuan, and the feeling of pain was greatly reduced. After sleeping for a while, it was already noon of the next day. Since all the materials had been gathered now, Han Shuo left the Cemetery of Death eagerly and headed towards the dwarves' village. He planned on asking the dwarf chief Calvin to forge the demon's lair edge for him. The dwarf village was located in a small mountain valley. There were enormous trees concealing the entrance of the village. If it weren't for the fact that Han Shuo had once made a trip here with the dwarves, he would have been hard-pressed to find their place of dwelling. Han Shuo was now quite familiar with the route and came to the dwarf village after a while. He threaded past the towering trees, and a dwarf, who stood guard with a sharp axe in hand in front of the village, immediately called out with a friendly voice, "Oh, good friend, you've come to visit us again." Following behind the dwarf, Han Shuo traveled through a small path with shrubs on both sides and finally made it to the dwarf village. Calvin, Bennett, and the others had heard the news and were all waiting merrily to welcome Han Shuo. Fine wine was quickly served. The dwarves lived in log cabins that they themselves had constructed, with some also living in empty-out tree hollows. There were only 100 or so dwarves in the village. Women and children were a good half of the numbers, and the warriors, who could truly fight, numbered not that many. Han Shoa had won the true friendship of the dwarves over this period of time. They were very generous towards Han Shoa. Whenever he came by, there was always fine wine and meats welcoming him, making him feel quite touched. "Han, how come you have time to stop by?" Calvin said merrily to Han Shoa. Taking out the materials that Phoebe had prepared from the space ring, Han Shoa handed them over to Calvin, saying, "Elder, these were the materials you requests. There's also enough black metal ore. Will you be able to forge a weapon for me?" Calvin took the materials from Han Shoa and looked at them carefully, saying with surprise, "Of course, absolutely. With enough materials to forge a great weapon, this is a happy matter for us. Don't worry, Han, we'll start working on it tomorrow. We'll be able to forge a weapon for you in about a week, and you're sure to be satisfied for it." Han Shoa truly breathed a sigh of relief with his guarantee and immediately expressed his genuine thanks to Calvin. The low complaints of some of the female dwarves came from afar. Han Shoa's ears were sharp, and he involuntarily listened closely to them. "Ai, it will be winter soon. We're never guaranteed of food in the big snow, and the chief has drawn from the stores many times to treat the guest. At this rate, how will we survive through the winter? Yes, I've also heard that the damned man-eating monsters have been around lately. It looks like they've come out to plunder and raid in order to make it through winter. If they discover our village, we'll have to move again. When will these days end?" The conversations of the female dwarves were all completely taken in by Han Shoa. He was a bit touched. It looked like the lives of the dwarves weren't as good as he thought, but even so, they had still taken out the best food to treat him. This made him feel quite guilty. He thought for a moment and sighed lightly, saying to Calvin, "Elder, do you not treat me as a friend?" "Han, why would you say such things? Have we treated you unkindly in some way?" Bennett, who was very kindly disposed towards Han Shoa, was the first to exclaim in surprise and looked at him in consternation before Calvin had a chance to open his mouth. Shaking his head, Han Shoa sighed, "Why must you worry about food and man-eating monsters, but refuse to tell me, your friend, about such matters? This won't do, since the elder is willing to bring out the winter rations to treat me, as your friend, I must do something. Don't worry, elder, I'll head for human society and help you solve the matter of winter rations. What else do you need apart from this? I can bring it all to you. How can we allow this? Although we're friends, we can't trouble you. We too wish to purchase these things in the human society, but there's a long stretch of dark forest between here and human society. Not only are there attacks from magical creatures on the journey, but we may run into adventurers with ill intentions. This is why we're forced to stay here. Han, I know that if you're to purchase those things for us, it will spend quite a bit of your money for sure. We can't trouble you like this. I think we'll work a bit harder and still get through this winter." Calvin said. "This matter is thus decided. I will help you think of ways to handle the matter of winter rations and the threat of the man-eating monsters. Just concentrate on forging weapons and leave the rest to me." Han Shoa made some internal calculations. There were roughly 100 or so in the entire dwarf village. He would probably have to make a few trips in order to bring the amount of food they needed to the cemetery of death, based on how much food the space ring could hold. If he purchased the food from Phoebe, he probably wouldn't need to spend that many gold coins. It was just a convenient favor to do, and Han Shoa was naturally happy to do so for the dwarves. "Thank you so much. I thank you on behalf of my child and the mothers within the village." A female dwarf suddenly heard Han Shoa's guarantee when she brought over fruit and was so moved that she immediately thanked Han Shoa with the greatest courtesy of the dwarves. "You're dismissed." Calvin admonished, and then also said with gratitude, "Han, we only create fine wines and forge weapons. Because we have exceedingly little contact with humans, we don't have that many gold coins. We're willing to make some fine wines and forge some weapons for you in exchange, otherwise I won't be able to accept your good intentions. Although Han Shuo didn't lust after their wine and weapons, but he understood that with the dwarves' obstinate tempers, they would be unwilling to accept his assistance for no reason at all. He finally accepted after thinking for a while. With the promise of winter rations from Han Shuo, all the dwarves were beyond excited. Even Calvin drank heartily with Han Shuo, a rare occasion indeed. He had to say that the wine made by the dwarves was truly quite sweet. Even the fine wine that Han Shuo had drank last night at the Buzzed Merchant Guild's banquet couldn't compare. Han Shuo was in an excellent mood after ensuring his demon's lair edge, and drank the night away with the dwarves. However, due to him practicing magic, he had already thoroughly sobered under the use of magical yuan when he left the dwarf village. He maintained a state of high alert as he traveled back to the cemetery of death. Before meditating, Han Shuo thought for a bit and decided to once more explore the boundary that had stopped Han Shuo from descending down to the lower levels of the cemetery of death. He wanted to see if he could break through that barrier with his current level of mental strength. After using the round, green ball to open the passageway, Han Shuo focused his mental strength and abruptly burrowed him. A piercing pain immediately filled his mind, but because he was used to the pain inflicted by the round, green ball during training, Han Shuo held up beneath the onslaught. He circulated his magical yuan to its highest and burrowed downwards.